And it's time to go live. Let's do this. Here we go. We are on the air. Brilliant. Welcome, comrades. It's good to see us all there in the chat. Thanks for being here on this Thursday evening. Maybe it's Thursday afternoon where you are. I'm not sure. But it's going to be a good one anyway, regardless of the time and place. Today we have Prolekult joining us. James, would you like to introduce yourself to the audience?
Hey, yeah, good to be here. Thanks for having me on, Paul. I'm James from Prolekult. I write and narrate our films. I'm a Marxist with, I would say, Leninist and, sympathies toward a lot of what Mao wrote, but not really a Maoist. I don't fully define myself as a Leninist either anymore, because I find that really, if we're coming down to it, it's best to just sort of go in on the one thing and go like, all of this is a body of literature. We should be discussing it. So I stick to Marxist. I'm quite a boring person in terms of myself, but I'm glad to be here and talk about the environmental stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's gonna be really cool. I was saying to you before we went live that this is kind of a little bit of a blind spot for me. Like I just don't know that much about it. I feel like in many cases we sort of come to the left and we all kind of know that things are fucked environmentally, and we just kind of accept that and just go, okay, well, we'll do socialism and everything's gonna be fine. So problem solved. It's almost like we don't even
Which is
need to.
kind of a problem in and of itself, right?
Yeah.
Like people going, oh, it'll be fine when we have socialism. We don't
Yeah.
need to think about it now.
Yeah.
It's kind of like when we get there, it's going to be like no one knows what they're doing, and things fall apart.
That's it. That is a little bit of a problem that we have across the Marxist tradition more broadly. I think there's kind of an expectancy that just like when the moment happens, we're just going to spring into action. Everything's going to be cool. It's all going to be fine. As soon as the revolutionary condition approaches us, as soon as we get to that moment, everybody's going to just magically, I don't know, be able to overthrow the state. We're all going to have weapons. We're going to be able to defend the revolution. Everything's going to be cool. We're going to reverse climate change. full automation overnight, magically.
Just gonna do it with the Soviet national anthem. Just keep singing and it'll be fine.
Soviet national anthem until full communism. Actually, on that, I'd love to know, just as a kind of an introduction, would you mind telling the audience a little bit about your background? I know you talk a little bit about your political background, about being a Marxist and so on. Would you mind talking a little bit about what brought you to the left and what brought you to communism more specifically, and sort of how you've arrived at this place over the years?
Yeah, no worries. So for my sins, I kind of went from, you sort of depoliticized liberal to an anarchist first. That happened from the student movement following the 2008 crash and the Occupier movement. I was young, kind of pissed off with everything, and went to anarchism that way. And then through the Occupy movement, I kind of saw how things weren't working. Like, how everything kind of revolved around a group of core individuals who tried to keep things together in that kind of anarchist-based movement.
Yeah.
And it just sort of didn't work, and everyone was passing the buck all the time. And then I went on a protest against workfare, which was like you have to work for your benefits policy that the Conservative government had at that point in time. And there was a social democratic organization. I won't name them for sake of throwing shade, but one of the three-letter abbreviations that are loyal to the Labour Party in Britain.
We'll say none.
Say no more. They just wanted to protest against McDonald's, and they had like all the signs printed out and everything was there, ready to go and do that. And us and my little anarchist friends, we couldn't really stop them because we weren't organized to stop them like at all. And so something went in my head and I was like, no, we need to be organized to actually do anything. And that's when I started to investigate Marxism more closely. And then I went through like a few organizations on the left and yeah, I sort of came to Marxist Leninism through that. And then sort of after kind of more historical research, just kind of settled on Marxism as a banner kind of politic, I guess.
Brilliant. And can you tell us, like, maybe, I'm not sure if this is really connected to that or if this is kind of a separate thing, but would you mind talking a little bit about Prolekult and how Prolekult came into being, and whether or not this was connected to this project or whether this was kind of separate to your political development, and sort of, if you could just give us kind of the roots and background story of Prolekult, I think that'd be really useful and interesting.
Yeah, no worries. So Prolekult happened about, like, I've been a communist for like nearly 10 years now. So like, it's been a while.
OG.
So Prolekult happened. I'm from the northeast of England originally. You probably can't hear it in my voice, but I'm from like around Newcastle. and then I was in a really rubbish job in marketing, but like kind of realized that you could reach a lot of people through these digital forms.
Yeah.
I then moved to Birmingham, where I met Alex, who sadly couldn't be here tonight, but she edits our films. She had a background in like wedding photography and editing for like that kind of stuff. And like, so so we kind of settled on doing this kind of like lefty politic kind of thing. And that sort of started the channel, and we did film poems at first, and the first 2 film poems are still up on the channel. They're not great, but they're there. The sort of the kind of thing you look back and go, "Oh, geez," a little bit. But
we've all been there. Don't worry.
Oh, I know but it's one of those things that you still have a cringe every so often.
I'm surprised though if you cringe at it that you haven't just like mass deleted all of the early videos, because I think most YouTubers, content creators, and so on will just kind of at one stage they'll like purge like the first year of their content.
I've noticed that's a tendency, but I'm kind of a fan of showing our mistakes because it helps other people, I think, see that like everything, you'll start off and then it might not have the results you want, but if you play around a bit, then you'll get there.
Yeah,
and I think leaving a mark there kind of helps other people kind of get the grips, if that makes sense.
Definitely, yeah.
So, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, like, I do find it quite humanizing when I go back and look at like early videos from big well-known YouTubers, and then you just kind of look at them and you kind of see how they've developed over the years, and it makes it all like a little bit more accessible, and a little bit more easy to manage, especially like if you're someone who's interested in doing this yourself as well, who's interested in putting out videos and talking online and all this sort of stuff. So anyway, yeah. I'm gonna go off a little tangent about that, but
I think it's part of like what I was when we started the channel as well. I was like releasing text documents alongside each video, like explaining like the techniques we'd used and things like that, because like the namesake of the channel is taken from like a mass arts movement in Russia, so I'm quite like pro showing people how to do these things, and trying to get them involved themselves, because I think it's really good that we have access to a mass media. And although a lot of like the left's like anti-podcast and anti-everyone having a podcast, like everyone having a podcast is good, really. Like,
yeah.
Like the working class have not been able to like publish their ideas very often. Like,
yeah, I'm a pro podcast gang. Rev Left Radio actually was like very much responsible for a lot of my own political development. So yeah, podcasts can have a like just because I'd be just going like in and out from work like every day, like cycling in and out to work, and like just listening to that every single day, just listening to the communist politics going into work and coming home from work. Half an hour there, half an hour back, and so it's like an hour each day of just communist education, which I think it's really important, and you wouldn't get otherwise. So yeah, I don't see any problem with that.
Yeah, and as well, like it's one of the things that the kind of big tech industries can't quite get their heads around, right, in terms of monitoring, because it's 2 hours of audio. Like you may well have voice recognition technology, but to understand what's said in those, you actually have to listen to them.
Yeah.
And most of the people who monitor the online left don't like to listen to our podcasts.
They're the anti-podcast gang. They're the one. It's actually like a COINTELPRO thing.
I would believe it these days, honestly.
Yeah.
Where was I with Prolekult? Yeah, I met Alex.
Yeah,
and we did these film poems, and then the Skripal stuff happened in England, the poisoning of the Russian spy, double agent, whatever it was. And I kind of through analyzing that, I kind of got to the position that and the analyzing Brexit as well. I kind of came to the conclusions that we put forward in our first film, that like the world's spinning toward like a pretty big confrontation, and figured like this isn't really talked about apart from the perspective of China versus the US, but like not any of the other kind of interests involved in that dispute. So I figured it was kind of important to put out a position that kind of accounted for that kind of stuff. And that's kind of how we got started. And then we got a really good reception to that. And I've been I had a Twitter account for quite a long time where I've just been firing off about things,
As you do on Twitter.
As you do. We got a really good response. So I was like, yeah, no, we'll do this. And Alex kind of was pretty pro it as well, and that's sort of just how we got started and kept going. Yeah.
Now here you are making full-on documentaries. Yeah, no, they're really good. Do you? I know. I think you mentioned Alex does sort of the editing and sort of thing. Do the two of you sort of write them together, and then you just sort of you do the voiceover, or how does that sort of work? If you don't mind.
I
talking about it.
mostly I mostly write them. Like there's a few bits Alex has written, and she's writing more. But I'd got a lot more kind of experience on the left and been a Marxist much longer than her, so I wrote a lot of the kind of scripts.
Mm.
We Demand Tomorrow is kind of not just it's written by me, but it's a composite of a number of different people's analysis as well. Like so we do like more collective things, which is stuff we're trying to do with our patrons now as well. But yeah, so it's not wholly me in terms of ideas. Like Ted Reese, the author, was involved in editing We Demand Tomorrow quite a lot. A good comrade of mine, Ada, was involved in editing through the script, and she actually looked through way back when we were just doing the first film we put out, History is Marching. So there's a few people involved in these things, but like I kind of have the final draft kind of say and writing kind of thing.
Right. Okay. Yeah. There's a few people have just actually commented in the chat. Everybody absolutely loves your work. We Demand Tomorrow, just absolutely amazing. We're going to be diving into a lot of the themes from that today. I just want to say to anybody in the chat here at the moment, anybody who's watching this now, please do subscribe to Prolekult's channel. It's absolutely amazing. It's full on like broadcast quality documentaries on YouTube. It's phenomenal. It's kind of like the future of broadcast of documentaries. I think it's really interesting, as you said, for normal working people to be able to produce this kind of stuff without massive budgets behind us, so it's really, really great stuff. Please subscribe to them on YouTube. Please follow them on Twitter, and if you can, give them a little bit of support on Patreon. There's a little comment here from the chat. Ben Thoth says Prolekult writing and narration is the most powerful combo I've seen in Marxist-Leninist sphere. Not an actual question. Smiley face.
Thank you very much, comrade.
Which I think is a really nice way to start. Thanks, Ben, for that really nice comment. I wish this was like always the case. I wish there was just like positive comments in the live chat all the way through. If there are any more positive comments, I'll read them out on the stream here. And any questions you have as well, we'll take them throughout. We're going to do Q&As throughout this conversation, so yeah, we'll have a lot of fun. We'll make it nice and interactive, and yeah, it'll be good. Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much, Prolekult. This is absolutely fantastic. Thank you, James, for that. Let's push on to the sort of main course of our conversation here. How is capitalism connected to environmental destruction? The big one.
Oh, okay. So first of all, it's just like statistically killing everything, right? Yep. And we can go through the banner figures there. Like you've got 100 companies, 71% of global carbon emissions. They're responsible for it. It's mostly oil and gas companies, but there's a lot of other culprits in there. You have in the next, by 2040, there's a plan to lay roughly 300 new oil and gas pipelines. And that's expected to add another 559 million tons of CO2 annually emitted to the atmosphere by that date. We have, then you kind of get into more complex questions, right? So one of the common environmental denier kind of arguments is that this has happened before. The Earth's temperature has changed before. We've had ice ages, we've had those end and all these kind of things. And that's true, but then you kind of have to just look at the statistics again to show that like this one's exceptional. So we had the kind of exponential growth in carbon emissions is 100 times faster than previous increases that we've seen with things like the end of the last ice age, like 11,500 years ago. So there's clearly quite a lot more going on there than just the Earth changing. Similarly, we've had other mass extinction events, like we're in a mass extinction event, but this one is between 1,000 and 10,000 times faster than any of those other events. So, and that includes the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs. Like,
what the fuck?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, it's that statistic blew my mind as well. It's actually terrifying. Like, we're talking about space can't kill us as fast as capitalism. Like,
oh my fucking god. Do you wait? Can I just
So
ask on this question that there's often, and maybe you might want to return to this later on. Would you mind? There's often this thing where people will say like we've got until 2030 before, like we've got sort of, it used to be 10 years. Like last year, people were saying 10 years, 11 years before that. Now it's just like we got 9 years until it's like irreversible. We're fucked, end of the world. Would you mind speaking to that at some point? I'll let you continue and go back to that. Maybe if you want to circle back to it, that might be useful. But I'm really
yeah,
curious to know
yeah.
if you could speak a little bit more on that and say
Well,
educate me.
it kind of ties into what I'm saying here because like we're in a mass extinction event, right?
Yeah.
Like by 2018, like so that's 3 years ago now. Um, humanity had seen 50% of all individual animals on the planet killed. Um, and we're in a position now with 20% of plant species already threatened by extinction. Um, and no, so that ties into like kind of where we're at. We're in a mass extinction. Those statistics that the 10 years, 9 years, 11 years, um, I think are kind of a reference to something that's quite important, which is the lag on carbon emissions. So carbon emissions impact the environment. They increase the temperature of the planet. There's about a 10-year lag on how long that takes. So the emissions we have now will impact the environment within 10 years. So that statistic kind of sets the stage for what damage has already been done.
Mm.
It doesn't account for the fact that those emissions are still rising. It doesn't account for the fact that like you still have these kind of problems mounting. So it's what I would say those kind of statistics are best case scenarios in a lot of ways. Like we're already in environmental chaos on quite an unprecedented scale and form.
Mm.
Um, and we haven't gotten rid of the social system that's causing it. So it's a really big problem. In terms of why it's causing it, though, I think that's important to kind of set out. It's because we have a social system which requires the conversion of raw materials into commodities for commodity production, right? So in the capitalist marketplace, you need to convert the coal, the land, the plants, the animals into raw materials. And you need to do that at an ever increasing rate in order to be able to make profits and keep the social system afloat. And that's a really specific contradiction rather than just kind of what it gets reduced to in a lot of discourse, which is a finite planet with finite resources,
Mm.
because the earth can replenish itself, right? It's just that capitalism necessitates extraction from that process at a speed faster than it can replenish itself. So that's the specific contradiction.
So you're saying that like 2030 is generous? What the
I'm
fuck?
saying, yeah. I mean, I think unfortunately, yeah. Um,
Oh fuck.
the thing with these things is like everyone kind of tends to think about environmental breakdown in terms of like an apocalypse movie rather than
Yeah.
the slow erosion of the basis for life. Like the coronavirus crisis is one example. The root of the coronavirus crisis is deforestation and coming into
Yeah. Yeah.
contact with animals that we haven't come into contact with before. And like the character of what environmental destruction looks like is going to be dodging viruses and trying to find food to eat, like rather than just everything catching fire and collapsing in a minute.
Mm.
So those kind of estimates are kind of generous in the sense of what they're referring to, that like complete environmental breakdown is happening right now.
Mm.
But they're also, I think, a bit too apocalyptic in that they paint the picture that it can't be reversed, which it can, which is the key thing.
All right, there's a light at the end of the tunnel coming over the horizon. That's nice to hear anyway. Some hope. I think it'll be a little bit more optimistic later in the stream when we start to talk about like what socialism and communism can actually do to change this and reverse things. But yeah, I suppose we have to go through this difficult conversation at the start. But there've been a couple of
Yeah,
comments. There's been a couple of Q and A's in the chat here. Would you mind just taking a couple of questions? Is that okay with you?
yeah, cool.
Great. Okay, so here's a recent one. Nahid Ahmed says, Cuba, according to the WWF, is the only nation to meet the conditions of environmental sustainability. Can you ask Prolekult how socialism can better handle climate change? Now, this might be a spoiler for later on because we're going to. Actually, that's the fifth question that we're going to come to: how socialism can prevent climate catastrophe. But would you like to touch on that now? Maybe talk about Cuba a little bit now, and then maybe we can circle back to the bigger question about how socialism and communism can help to reverse this and set us back on the right track.
Yeah, I can touch on Cuba because I think on the one, it's a good example of how you can do certain things within limitations, right? So Cuba is environmentally sustainable partially because of socialism and partially because of how isolated it is and how it can't get access to a lot of industrial materials, which is a point that like has to be made in relation to the blockade. So it's not just that. At the same time, I don't want to diminish their achievement because like organoponicos and sustainable agriculture and all these other kind of amazing achievements that they managed. I was lucky enough to actually see. I've been to Cuba, and I was lucky enough to actually see one of the city farms that they have, which are like farms in local neighborhoods that anyone from the neighborhood can work on and take the produce from. So it becomes like a communal collective property, and it's a really, really kind of amazing, like just thing. But it also shows the limitations of that, right? Because Cuba's still an export and import driven economy. It relies upon tourism. And I suppose the limitation that Cuba really displays is, yes, Cuba itself is environmentally sustainable, but Cuba itself is only one small island nation in a world that is still hurtling toward destruction. So it's not reversing anything, you know?
Drop in the ocean, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for speaking to that a little bit, and we'll circle back to the other half of that question a little bit later on. Just a couple, we'll just take maybe one or two more Q&As, and then we'll push forward again. So a question from a little while ago, maybe just towards the start of the stream. Zadrona, I can't actually pronounce that. Zdroneh. Paul, what does Prolekult think about the industrial reindustrialization? A big section of the Turkish bourgeois supports reindustrializing on more eco grounds to allow capitalism to expand.
So, what they mean, right? So we do need a new industrial revolution, but there are different possibilities posed as to how that can happen and what that means. So the solution I would advocate for is like really specific in terms of what we mean by eco. The combination of environmentally, like not environmentally friendly, environmentally restorative industrial kind of production. What the bourgeoisie mean by that is we're going to build these really nice new factories, and then we're going to plant some trees, and that solves the problem. And that solution is insane.
Okay, thank you very much. Great. Okay, we'll do one more, and then we'll push forward. Sorry, I know I'm hassling you. Just throwing all these questions at you. This one you might like this one though. You might like this one. It's pertaining to your work. A person called E says, Paul, I just watched History is Marching. How have nukes changed the game of imperialist wars? Do you think nuclear weapons will be used in war between the great powers if it gets to that?
I mean, the US has a nuclear policy that says they will. Like, I know there's saber rattling and nuclear posturing, but then there's also the fact that in its victory, the US nuked Japan when it was completely tactically useless to do so. In its downfall, what do you think it's going to do? Because it's not going to be pretty. The kind of big concern around nukes is that, aside from a kind of apocalyptic retaliatory situation, which is wholly possible and is more possible the less attention it gets, which is the kind of key thing to stress there. Like in the Cold War, people were concerned about nukes. Now, it doesn't really come up that much, even though it's more of a pressing threat with more actors who work independently of each other and have bigger stockpiles. But the bigger kind of big problem is something put in place in the US under the Obama administration. So it's a bipartisan endeavor, which is something called precision nuclear weaponry, which is the idea that if you have a yield that's incredibly small, you can target a specific area and have a small nuke go off, and therefore apparently that won't ignite a bigger conflict. The US actually frames those weapons in its 2019 nuclear policy, which hasn't been updated yet. I'm not saying it won't be. In its 2019 nuclear policy, frames those weapons as a way to restore stability in regions it loses control over. So it's a really difficult question. We don't have an anti-nuclear movement, and we also don't really have much of an anti-war movement at this point in time. So, it's a distinct possibility.
Fuck. This has been bleak so far. I'm not gonna lie.
we write some really bleak things, but like I think the thing I always find is it's less scary if you face up to it, right? Like if you look it in the face, you say this is, then they can't be like freak you out when it happens. At least you've got an idea of what could happen. You know,
we knew this was coming. We knew the apocalypse was coming. That's fine. You know the picture of like the dog in the room and like it's all up in flames around them. This is fine. Okay.
And that is Western culture these days, isn't it?
Oh my god, it's too real. Okay, so let's push forward with these questions here that we had written down beforehand, and then we'll return to some of the Q&As after this. Okay, so a lot of capitalists will talk about a Green New Deal. It's big in the US, it's big all over the world. They talk about it all across Europe, the UK, all kinds of places, you know. So can these problems be solved with a Green New Deal? Is it or is it not sufficient, and why or why not?
So before I get to the economic critique of it, I just want to kind of point out that the idea put forward falls down on even the most basic terms. It falls down on its own view in that it doesn't even really understand the environmental crisis. So what we hear from these people is that we need to reach net zero, right? That big phrase, net zero emissions.
Yeah.
But the problem with that is, as we said, we've already reached past a number of tipping points. So, for example, last year, 2020, Arctic ice went to near ice-free conditions in the sea just off Alaska. Permafrost, not expected to melt until like 90 years time, began to thaw, and within that permafrost in the Arctic is 4 times the carbon ever emitted by humanity, and that's already melting. The IPCC report released last month suggests we've already passed the tipping point in terms of carbon emissions. So like we already have enough carbon in the atmosphere to push us past that 2 degrees centigrade temperature rise, which brings about all these apocalyptic scenarios in terms of the Earth's habitability. And we're now just waiting through, as I said earlier, that delay on when carbon emissions actually impact the temperature, that sort of 10-year delay. So the idea of net zero, the big goal that they kind of parade, is utterly insufficient to meet the climate crisis, even if it were achieved by capitalism. We don't just need a mode of production that puts us in a position where we don't do any more damage, because the damage that we've already done is exponential. What we need to do instead is reverse that. We need a restorative mode of production, and net negative on emissions is the key word there. Or rather, we need to pull down more carbon, not only than we emit, but also at an ever increasing rate. We need to pull down that carbon. And that's just the reality of the climate crisis. Like, so on its own terms, the Green New Deal doesn't work. Like the big proposals of the utopians pushing it doesn't work. The other problem with it is it actually makes things worse, which is like, I know.
Jesus, I've got 2 beers sitting beside me for today. I've just taken it easy tonight, just a couple of beers. I'm just like, oh fuck, I need something. I need something harder. This is.
Get the vodka out, honestly.
Oh God.
Like,
Where's
it
your
just
coffee? It's vodka. Yeah, okay.
it doesn't get better. I have to say, like it doesn't get
Uh,
better.
well, it will under socialism,
Um,
but
it will under socialism, but I suppose setting it out clearly as to why we need socialism,
yeah,
because without it, we are kind of fucked.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so the way it would make it worse, we mentioned in the film, is 111% increase in the extractions from the mining industry, which already accounts for 50% of global emissions. So that's increasing global emissions by at least a quarter, just to get the infrastructure constructed, which is unthinkable in our context, really, and doesn't even account for like. So one of the big ones is like electric cars, right?
Yeah.
They're all like, oh, if we get electric cars, then things will be better. Don't think about how we charge them. Is kind of a big problem that's not mentioned when you talk about electric cars. Similarly, I saw a study, I can't confirm the accuracy of this one, but there was a study that suggested just electric cars replacing cars in like mainland Britain, like England even, would be like all the world's cobalt gone. Like whether or not there is, yeah.
What the fuck? Come on, give me some good news.
Um,
Balance it out.
so the Green New Deal can't do it. Is the upshot of it? It just can't do it. And actually, what it does is, and that's assuming that they do it. What we've seen with the Paris Climate Accords is not a single signatory is actually kept to them. We see now Germany, the supposed green capital of the world, is using a green fund to circumvent sanctions on Nord Stream 2, which is an oil and gas pipeline. Like,
Sorry, it's just gonna be me groaning for like the next hour and a half, I think.
when we get to the communism part, then things like properly get better.
Yeah,
like,
it always makes things better, but we'll have to push through the capitalist bullshit before then, I suppose.
it's a really hard one to do, because like when you're talking about these things, it's really hard to find something to say other than Jesus, this is depressing.
Yep, it's fucked. Absolutely, thoroughly fucked. Yeah.
Final
Jesus.
reason, I guess,
Yeah.
the Green New Deal can't work. Well, I've got two written down. We can go for the more or the less depressing one, I guess.
Let's go for both. Fuck it. Let's just power through them.
Okay.
Let's just do it.
I'll go with the really depressing one first, which
Yeah,
is that the way capitalism replaces or replicates ecosystems, so all this kind of replanting element in the Green New Deal, is wrong. So a really good example for this is moss and trees. So if you see any tree which has smooth bark and it has moss on it, the moss can't actually grow on the bark. It would die if it grew directly on the bark. So what it does is it grows on the small little bits of rough wood where leaves fall off. And it grows there, and it keeps growing there over and over and over again. And so if it's covering the whole tree, it's pretty much as old as the tree itself. So when you cut down a tree with that kind of tree with that kind of moss on, you can't replicate it by just replanting another tree of the same nature. You've killed part of that ecosystem for good. And so a lot of this kind of replanting and stuff is only partial. It replants a sort of monocrop and can't replicate the ecosystem that has been destroyed in the speed at which capitalism does these things. So it's wholly impractical, and it doesn't offset carbon in the way that it's claimed to. So that's another reason that the kind of the replanting element of it is kind of farcical and not really fully true. And then the final reason that the Green New Deal can't work is that capital can't actually do it, because if you did construct the windmills and the solar panels and the turbines, what you've created there is automated infrastructure. And if capital creates automated infrastructure, it can't exploit labor power anymore to make a profit on it, so it would shut it down.
Oh. If only there was a system where everybody could
Oh,
benefit from automation. Well, spoilers anyway. We'll come back to that. Circle back to
yeah, it's totally unrelated to now. Yeah.
that.
But yeah, I think that that kind of economic part is really important to note because like that plays into broader tendencies within capitalism, which is kind of where contradictorily hope starts to come through, right? Like we have this awful circumstance where the world is dying, all this kind of things are happening. That's all true. But then we have the potential to change that. And the reason for that is capitalism is breaking down as this process gains steam, right? Like it's falling apart. And I think that's where hope starts to come through. And one symptom of that is the fact that the green infrastructure would by some estimates reduce energy prices to zero by 2050 if it was made.
Wow. Wow. No, you mentioned something interesting there, and you've said this on a couple of occasions. You've said that capitalism is economically heading for its final crisis. So why is that, and what does that mean when you say that?
So you've heard of the rate of profit argument in Marx. How you have a ratio of profit to investment, and the breakdown of capitalism is essentially through all three volumes of Capital. Marx argues that capitalism is a self-abolishing economic system. It's historically transitory, and it does that because of like very visible economic kind of measures. So the rate of profit is what dictates whether or not capitalists will invest, and what that refers to is the ratio of profit to investment, not absolute profits, not like just the sheer mass of profits accumulated by a capitalist, but the amount relative to investment, the percent gained from that investment. And that's important because it explains the logic behind how capital operates. Capitalism needs not only to increase the amount of overall profits, but the rate of that expansion. It always needs to be increasing the rate at which it expands itself. Otherwise, what happens is investors look at an investment and they hoard their wealth and production breaks down. Now, that's fundamentally a social crisis, which manifests itself in a complete polarization of wealth. And we're already living through world historic levels of inequality where the top 1% of humanity own about as much as the bottom 50%. And so that was before the pandemic, and through the pandemic, we've seen the wealthiest people on the planet increase their wealth by 35% in some places. And that always correlates to a dispossession of the rest of people. Now, the reason that happens is because of the development of the means of production, right? So we have, as Marxists, we have this analysis that the means of production are kind of how a material relation is maintained between the means of production and the people who work them. So there's the means of production, the relations of production. And as the means of production develop, they open up the possibility for new relations of production. And that's the historical materialist kind of theory of history. So competition in capitalist society pushes the capitalist class to develop more and more productive forms of machinery, to develop more and more productive factories, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, that has the contradiction of they need to employ less workers to do that. And so what happens there is the ratio, the rate of profit, the amount of investment relative to profit gained reduces. And Marx argues that is going to fall historically towards zero. There's a Polish Marxist, Henryk Grossman, who argues that there's 4 countermeasures that capitalism can have to offset that crisis. The first is lowering wages. And so if you pay people less, then you can extract more profit out of them, even if you are employing their labor at a less kind of a lower rate. You can export capital to the oppressed world, and so invest in cheaper land prices and cheaper wages and engage in imperialist super exploitation. You could devalue capital or destroy it through war, or you can develop the productive forces so you gain competitive advantage and gain a profit to a certain degree. Now, all of those counter tendencies are today kind of being exhausted. So what we've seen is like even with many of these countermeasures in play, like the degree of wealth inequality has expanded enormously. The wages have remained fairly static for considerable number of years, if not even fallen in relation to inflation. The export of capital to the oppressed world is becoming less and less profitable as we're seeing deindustrialization kind of take hold across the world. Like most of the world's workforce is now deindustrialized. It's gone through a process of industrialization and is now deindustrialized, even in countries that have historically been oppressed nations and still are oppressed nations. But even in those nations, we're seeing that process of deindustrialization. The big important examples there being the continent of Africa, which has long been promised a process of industrialization to boost its economy. And that's one of the main reasons that even the comprador bourgeoisie have accepted on like unacceptable terms. And then like all that investment has been withdrawn in the last sort of 5 to 10 years. So that's kind of happening. And we're now encroaching on a number of like absolute limits to capital accumulation. So since the 1960s, the GDP growth of the imperialist nations has fallen from about 5.6% a year to 2%. Productivity growth in the imperialist nations particularly has fallen below 1% since 2011. World debt stands between 225% to 560% of world GDP. And that's before the pandemic. Since the pandemic, that lower estimate has increased to about 365% of world GDP. Then currencies are now being exhausted. So we have like the pound has lost 99.5% of its value since its founding. The dollar has lost 96% of its value since 1913. And interest rates, which historically cutting an interest rate has been a way that the capitalists have got themselves out of a crisis. It normally requires a cut of about 4%. They're now at zero across the world, pretty much. I think the only exception is China. And so that is all manifesting in this fundamental impossibility of a new stage of capital accumulation. Underneath that, there is a material development in the productive forces. So the only way that the capitalists could develop the productive forces further is through automation. And automation, as we've said, removes the only thing that generates value, which is human labor power. And so that's actually a self-abolishing tendency. What that means is kind of hard to predict, but we can see a few things starting to happen already. The first is inflation is going to hit, and it's going to hit very, very hard. And we've already seen that in Indonesia this year. The price of tofu went up by the 1st of March, had gone up 30%. Beans in Brazil have gone up 54% since last year. Sugar in Russia has gone up 61%. And all these kind of things represent a breakdown in productive forces and the creation of ever greater masses of dispossessed people and the concentration of wealth in ever fewer hands, which produces a society that doesn't work as investment breaks down. Production can't happen. People can't be fed. These things become impossible at a certain point. And so what that leaves humanity with is starve to death or take over production yourself. And that process, yeah, tough choice. But it's kind of the logic. It's the logic of kind of accumulation coming to an end. There's no way out of this for capital, because even the more extreme option, the last time they had an overproduction crisis anywhere near this, they had to have 2 world wars to get out of it and fascism. Well, if they do that, we're all dead. So it's impossible at this point. So from the standpoint of human survivability, from the economic standpoint of capitalism, it's completely and utterly falling apart. It can't function. That doesn't mean that like it's just gonna stop, because they will try to do these things, but it does mean that there's going to be ever greater masses of working class people, oppressed people in the world to struggle against that process. So I think that's the kind of really important thing to take a hold of here, is that the economic system can't solve these problems, and that's going to give us ever greater audience as Marxists and communists to actually try and mobilize people, to try and organize people to defend themselves. So yeah.
Oof, that's where we step in. We've got a body of work to do ahead of us. Jesus Christ, it's so bleak. But that's we're actually, I think we're over the worst of it actually, which is good, I suppose.
Yeah, we're on the nice bits, aren't we?
Yeah, we're now we're getting into the communism and socialism, and yeah, there's a lot to look forward to here. We can do a few Q&As I think before then, and
Yeah.
we'll fire through those. I just had one come in there from actually I'll just do a quick little shout out. Red Fenian Punk says, Sir Shigriv and Paul Moran, please do tell my friend that an old pal and comrade says hi. Wink, winky face. So
I think I know who that is. Hello, comrade. Long time no speak.
I assume that winky face has some sort of significance to you. So,
they're quite a cheeky fellow.
It's good guys. Often a regular in the chat here. Ben Redwood says, the climate emergency forced me to look at communism with an open mind. Is this rare, or should communists use the crisis to win people over? And that's probably going to lead in pretty well to our next conversation, or excuse me, our next question about how socialism and communism can help in prevent climate catastrophe, which we might have to circle back to if we want to answer a few more Q&As. But what do you think? Should we sort of be rallying around the environmental issues from a communist perspective?
Yes, I think we should also be aware of some of the limitations of doing that in some ways, though, because yes, it can persuade a lot of people, but we also need to focus on the economic crisis a lot more than we are, in my opinion, because there's orders of immediacy for people, and in a lot of ways, the way that, particularly since the pandemic the crisis has hit people, it's kind of easier to first persuade them on an economic basis, which is almost kind of better in a way, because then you're putting forward proletarian interests, and those can sometimes get a bit lost in the environmental conversation, I think. Because the argument for kind of what class needs to lead that transformation doesn't come out of the environmental analysis by itself, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, Extinction Rebellion and so on and so forth. Just specifically distancing themselves from the socialism or extinction slogan, I think was quite.
Oh yeah, the YCL took the banner, didn't they?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and they had the hammer and sickle and all, and they were just like, "This does not represent us."
I mean, they've actually gotten to the stage XR where they're shopping people to the pigs. There was in an interview.
Christ.
Yeah, it was in an interview they were recently saying that I think it was the Tories have mandated this kind of review of hard left and hard right extremism to draw a false equivalency between communists and the fascists, and XR were kind of agreeing with that in one of the interviews I saw in the Telegraph. So yeah, wow. quite crazy. Me and Alex actually in the kind of short video we did on them selling Extinction, we went to their demonstration in London, and it was the day after activists had literally been assaulted by the police, and it's in the video, but they were chanting, "Not one protester has been injured," when the police arrived to arrest people, and we were just like, "What the hell are you doing?"
We are not a threat. We are not a threat.
And then at the same time, they do shout that we are not a threat, and then the Home Office calls them terrorists because we're in this ridiculous world where anything can be construed as anything.
Jesus Christ.
Matt, can anyone seriously imagine George Monbois being a threat to anyone? Except maybe his own ego.
Okay, thank you, comrade. Next one here. Let's see. We have here's one from before that we missed. Pants with 3 T's. Paul, could you talk about we mentioned this earlier on. They just say deforestation is the root cause of coronavirus. Do you want to talk about that? The deforestation, the logging, and stuff that sort of may have caused it to spread to humans, and what happened there? Do you want to touch on that a little bit more and maybe flesh it out a little bit? for people who haven't heard
Yeah,
about
so
this?
I think the most likely scenario is right. So you've got a conspicuous consumption in kind of market meats, which has grown as a trend in China since the since the swine flu outbreak meant they had to kill a lot of pigs in 2018. They've particularly seen a growth in this kind of conspicuous consumption of bat meat and stuff, which is a delicacy. I think the racism surrounding that in the Western press is abhorrent, but it is still drawn from sources where people don't normally eat this stuff. And what we've seen to get that is deforestation, and a lot of the kind of kind of more isolated communities in China, which previously operated as a kind of epidemiological words. A barrier because they've been used to it. Were kind of, they've come into contact with these animals, so they've developed resistances to these kind of diseases, and they act as a barrier for a lot of the kind of diseases that come out of these sort of more distant animals. And the most likely scenario for me is it did come from that market in China, and it was derived from these animals which like massive Chinese population don't come into contact with because of the growth in that kind of conspicuous consumption. Yeah.
Thank you very much for explaining that. Brilliant. We'll take one more and then we can push on to the positives. So let me see here. Here's an interesting one. Again, good to have a few questions from here, Conrad. Thank you very much. Paul. It says Paul and then Prolekult. So this is actually for you. Prolekult. Allowing yourself to speculate freely, is there any scenario where the environmental crisis can be solved without moving past capitalism? Without using 2 letters.
I think that the 2-letter answer is kind of the only one. Just no. So there's one potential speculative scenario we could go with, which is something that is definitely pushed by sections of the bourgeoisie, which is this idea of financializing nature. Yeah. The problem therein is that it would still be fundamentally irrational, and so you can't. Just nah.
I see what you did there. NaH, 3-letter alternative. Very clever. You win this one. You win this one, Prolekult.
We got out of it this time.
I'll let you
okay. Unless Elon Musk can escape us, get a civilization on Mars. No.
Could you imagine if he did and he just proved all of us wrong?
Oh, I don't even want to think of work camps on Mars.
He just blasts a car out to Mars. Everyone's just flying off in fucking interstellar taxis. Let's see, interstellar Ubers maybe or something like that.
Yeah,
fucking Teslas blasting through space. Anyway,
would definitely have to be an app on Mars for Elon, wouldn't it? Like it would just be the cult of Elon, right? It would be a bunch of people bowing and kissing his feet every day, and it would be mental.
Like a DPRK without any of the good parts at all, just all of the, like, whatever the worst character you imagine and you hear about, like North Korea, it'd be that, but ultra capitalist, ultra capitalist. Yeah,
like I think it would be like they would have a false ideological binary. It would be like the cult of Elon dominates, but the music of Grimes offers as resistance.
That's the controlled opposition that they offer to placate the masses. Oh my god. Bleak. Let's not give them any ideas. Maybe Elon's watching my stuff here.
Elon probably has an algorithm that searches for his name on the internet, so he may well be in the chat now.
You're talking about shit. Get over to Paul's channel. Yeah, I'm gonna get pulled off YouTube suddenly, very suddenly, and very. Yeah. Well, anyway, okay, let's push forward. Here we go. We're gonna jump into the positives. Are you ready? We've had an hour of bleak, darkness, no light. We finally reached the horizon. Things are looking up, light at the end of the tunnel. We're gonna hear all about it now. Comrades, tell us, how can socialism and communism prevent climate catastrophe?
Okay. So we've had. So we'll start from the economic breakdown of capitalism. So as we said, we're going to see masses and masses more people become dispossessed. Production is going to start to break down and not function properly, which provides the largest ever economic incentive toward the formation of a proletarian state. The largest ever mass of dispossessed workers who have to have the initial task of wresting production from destruction. And that can only be achieved by what Marx referred to as the lower stage of communism, the stage of socialism, a proletarian dictatorship or a proletarian state. Now, that's for a number of reasons which begin to develop the new mode of production. The first of which is planning, which is that you need like a real actual economic plan that people stick to in order to be able to combat sustained collapse into ecological nightmare. Otherwise, you're just doing random things and tinkering around without any like idea of what you're doing, right?
That's my life.
Like you just
Sorry, go on.
No, it's all right. I relate, to be fair. Oh, but yeah. So you end up you need a planned economy, and that's only possible with socialism, with owning by removing the profit motive and being like able to direct certain processes. And we're going to need that in the first instance because people won't be fed without it. Like straightforwardly, straight up, that's where it's going to go. But that opens up the possibility to develop some really nice things, first of all, which we need, which is mass democracy. We need mass democracy to do that planning because we need a way of conveying the environmental conditions in everyone's own locations to be able to actually combat that disaster, right? You can't abstract the climate crisis because ecosystems are concrete things that exist in concrete locations. And so you need a mass democracy, unprecedented in human history, over production, if you're going to be able to respond to all those problems. And that provides the basis, a mass democracy of the proletariat and oppressed in a proletarian state, controlling production, provides the basis to develop the new mode of production, the communist mode of production. Now, to start talking about that, I want to talk about a Soviet theorist named Volkov, whose book, The Era of Man or Robot, is incredibly rare and like probably one of the most prescient texts ever written. It was written in 1968, and it's about automation. And what he says about automation is that it's only logical to this is a direct quote. It is only logical to expect that the next foreseeable leap in technology will be tied up with the use of production of the biological properties of living matter with a view to achieving an ever more radical transformation of nature. So he's saying the next mode of production will be the use of the production of biological properties of living things, so ecosystems, plants, animals, all the processes of life on our planet, to achieve an ever more radical transformation of nature. In our context, that's actually not change in like we're going to fly or anything. That's the retaining of Earth's habitability is that radical transformation. And so he provides a few kind of ways into looking at that. But the key one to me is he describes automation not as like machine automation, but as the combination of all sciences, right? And that leads you to be able to look at what's been neglected in terms of the sciences, their development under capitalism, the mode of production, and its development under capitalism. And the big thing that comes out of that is actually the natural sciences, which are the preserve of a few conservationists, people who are kind of invested in permaculture and so on and so forth, from their own economic interests or their kind of own academic interests. It's not many people who do this. And actually, when you think about what the communist mode of production needs to be, Marx says that it has to transform the nature of labor. It has to involve that it has to get rid of class It has to remove class and abolish class. To communist society is a classless, nationless society. And we can now see from the environmental crisis that that's actually materially required if we're going to be able to survive. So we can first of all see that it needs to be a global society because it's a global crisis which can't be responded to without it being a global society. Because if you still have one nation emitting more carbon than the rest of the nations combined are pulling down, then you're ruined. So we need that global society. We also need it not to be driven by class, because we all need a mass democracy where we're making decisions on a local level that are then fed up and discussed at a global level. So we need that mass democracy and that abolition of economic class to achieve that. We also then, from the requirements of the environmental crisis, can see what the basis for that can be. So we need a restorative mode of production, one that not only evens out the damage we're doing to the earth, but replenishes the earth in its very material constitution, and but also allows a development of the productive forces, because we have in the past had certain economic systems prior to the formation of class that have been existed in harmony with nature. Now, before I get on to why we can't just go back to those, I want to highlight something about them, because we're so deep into the environmental crisis now that I think it's often impossible for people to imagine a positive relationship to nature, if that makes sense. Like, we're so far gone that people kind of just don't really know what that would look like. Yeah. When we can actually see mutually beneficial relationships with nature in those early societies in a number of ways. So there were forest gardens, which cultivated greater quantities of plants, because what they did was these societies would engage in forest burnings where they burned down parts where old decayed plants had grown, and controlled burnings, and that would expand the area which the forest could claim, and would allow new life to grow on those things and enhance the biological replication of these cycles. Then you had hunting, so trapping. Trapping can actually be a beneficial relationship for nature, because you get certain species of animals that are so good at surviving in kind of different areas that they start to overwhelm the area and get rid of the diversity of species in the area. So actually skimming a few off the top reduces their ability to do that and allows other forms of life to flourish as well as that species. Even fishing has a basis in really positive relationships. So salmon in North America are a huge source of fish, and they return to North America very frequently. And the indigenous populations which lived on the coast where the salmon kind of migrate, I can't remember the name of the tribe right now, but they had rituals where they lit fires and welcomed the salmon back into the land. They allowed a certain number of salmon to pass before they would take any, so the salmon would definitely get to their breeding grounds and be able to replenish them. But by lighting the fires, they were also signaling to other wildlife in the area that the salmon were coming here. By taking them, they were also kind of able to like thin out that number so it wasn't too plentiful, and they were able to kind of mate in peace. And also by having the fires, they summoned animals to that location and showed that the salmon were there. So deep was that relationship that the salmon don't return to that shore without those fires. So profound was that relationship that actually the animals have remembered it from generation to generation as a positive part of their life cycle. So I think that, knowing that about these older societies is really important, because it shows that we can coexist with nature in a positive way. The reason we can't just go back to that is because the ecosystems have broadly been destroyed, but also because there is such a great human population we can't all be like migratory societies that move around. We can't all kind of, sort of travel all the time. And so we need to find a way to incorporate these reciprocal, important, restorative relationships with nature into a new industrial mode of production. And what we need to do that is the construction of productive ecosystems and plant-based infrastructure. Plant-based is kind of a bit of a misnomer because I also think fungi, which are closer related to animals than plants, are really important for this. But plant-based kind of covers the idea of what I'm meaning. So
I'm gonna have to ask you about that. I'm not gonna derail you right now. I know you're in the middle of a really important point. But I would like to know about the distinction between plants and animals and how fungi and mushrooms and stuff like that are closer to animals. Yeah, I want to put a pin in that and maybe circle back to it as I've been saying over and over.
Make a note of that.
Please, yeah, I'd love to hear more about
that. Okay, so hemp, right? We're on to hemp. So plant-based infrastructure. Hemp can be used. Hemp is a really good crop to illustrate how this is possible, right? It's not the only solution. It's not a silver bullet because monocultures are actually the problem. But it does show how plant matter can be integrated into industrialized productive forms, and how industrialized productive forms can be changed to be not environmentally friendly, but environmentally restorative. So hemp can be used to make up to over 50,000 products. Crucially, among those, it can be used to make bioplastic that is stronger than steel. It can be used to make fuel that is 2/3 cleaner than fossil fuels. And it can be used to make transistors and batteries. So it can replace a lot of the minerals that are used in the creation of electronics and digital systems. And I feel like that's probably the most significant use of hemp. It can, in its growth cycle, reverse desertification. So if you grow hemp, you can't reverse all deserts. Mosses can, though. But most deserts, desertification can be reversed by hemp because it has very, very deep roots that then pump carbon back into the earth, which allows it to circulate in the soil a lot easier. And that is one of the key bases for making good soil. In its growth cycle, in 1 hectare of hemp can pull down 15 tons of CO2. And it does that in 60 days, which is the fastest CO2 to biomass conversion known to the human species. So that's hemp. And I think what hemp really illustrates, as I say, is the fact that plant matter can be integrated into industrial production, that it is possible to create an environmentally restorative mode of production out of plant matter and out of these kind of things. Another illustration of that is mycelium, or mushrooms, or fungi, as we know them rather, which can be used to create packaging, clothing, food, construction materials, all these kind of different things. Now, to put a pin in that, those are 2 different examples that I've given there. We have only, as a species, discovered 86% of the species on this planet. So we have we've only discovered, other way, 86% of the species on this planet have not been discovered by our species.
Oh yeah,
we don't know.
I'm glad you reversed that because I was like, that's actually pretty good. Like 86%. That's like if I got that score like in a college exam, I'd be like, it's a pretty solid, pretty solid result, all things considered. But okay, so opposite.
Other way around. 86% of the species are unknown, right?
Right. Yeah.
And that is mostly actually concentrated in animals because like they're what we're most interested in. And you can see that with fungi, we've only discovered 7% of fungi, right? Like and fungi is really fascinating. Fungi is like a requirement for most life on Earth. Before plants had evolved to have roots, fungi served as its roots. Even today, we have recently discovered the extent of the mycelium network, which attaches itself to trees, redistributes resources through from one tree to another tree, including minerals, including different kind of properties, including water, can send electrical signals, right? And that's, we know that now. But that shows like how much of the natural world there is left to explore and kind of understand, and how many different productive qualities could be unlocked from plants, from kind of fungi. Similarly, even the ones that we have discovered, even the plant species we have discovered, the fungi species we have discovered, we don't really know all that much about a lot of it. Like we still, as a species, don't know why nettles sting us. We still, as a species, don't know why mast flowering occurs, which is when like nut trees, they don't give off their nuts every year. They give them off seemingly randomly, and they all do it at the same time, so it's not environmentally conditioned. We don't know why that happens. So there's so many different things that we don't actually know about the world we live in, and particularly plant and fungi, that the extent of industrial applications is absurd. Fungi, the enzymes created by certain types of fungi are already an integral part of industrial production. They make up 60% of the chemicals used in industrial production. The penicillin is drawn from fungi. Like, all these different things are like created by these plants. And what that allows us to see is we can incorporate these things into industrial production. The study of them could be unlocked by a directed proletarian state, which puts masses of resources into the study of the natural world, which A, allows us a mass base to reverse the environmental crisis, and B, dissolves the distinction between manual and intellectual labor, as Marx foresaw in Capital. And C, allows the creation of an environmentally restorative mode of production, where what we're attempting to do is create ecosystems with masses of diversity. And at this point, it allows us, I think, to define communist abundance as well, which is what the communist mode of production would essentially be. It's an abundant mode of production that eliminates the conditions of scarcity that give rise to class. And so what that would be is not abundance in the kind of luxury commodity sense as people like Aaron Bastani would have it in fully automated luxury communism, but rather communist abundance refers to the abundance of life on this planet and the abundance of new ways to live life, the new ways to live on this planet. And that's ultimately what our project is as Marxists, right? It's to expand human freedom and defend human dignity, and to create more life and new modes of life. And that's all possible with a communist mode of production and a communist green industrial revolution.
So you're telling me that weed and shrooms can cure the cancer of this planet?
Pretty much, yeah. You
heard it, Prolekult 2021 legalized.
But here's the thing, right? Here's the really mad bit, okay? The US lobbies knew that hemp could be used to do these things, and that is why they criminalized it, right? Like,
that's like super villain shit. You can save the planet with weed, ban that shit.
There's a propaganda film called Reefer Madness, right?
I've seen that. Jesus fucking Christ.
Yeah. Guess who funded that? It was the oil lobby.
Oh fuck! I didn't know they funded that. I've seen it, but I think you can watch it on YouTube. But I didn't know the oil lobby funded that.
Yep.
That's crazy.
And the mass criminalization of these things, their transformation into just drugs, is actually a really modern phenomena. Like, humans have used hemp since there have been humans. Like, it has been well integrated into our mode of production. We used to make clothes out of it, and we used to eat it. Like,
isn't the U.S. Constitution, isn't that written on hemp paper? If I'm not mistaken.
It is, yeah.
I mean, that's a bit of a slap. But I don't know. If I'm not mistaken, they've kind of shifted the laws a little bit now, so that I think it's kind of loosened up a little bit. I think hemp's being sort of taken back into the fold a little bit now, and I wonder how that fits into the analysis. But and weed's being legalized everywhere as well, which, obviously it's being legalized for people to get stoned in many cases, but it also opens up the pathway to explore hemp and cannabis a little bit more for more than just getting baked out of your mind. Let's say.
So, I mean, like, the problem here is, right, the hemp that's easy to grow isn't the hemp, industrial hemp, which is the hemp that we're referring to in terms of mode of production, is not the same as kind of the cannabis hemp.
So you got like super hemp.
We've got like cannabis hemp is flowering. Cannabis hemp is like is kind of artificially been created to be a drug, and so that's the one that the laws are kind of loosening up on most of all. is the drug hemp, because it allows a creation of a commodity that can be sold.
Mm.
Industrial hemp is still much harder to get the permits for, bizarrely, even though it's not the drug.
Yeah, that doesn't make any sense at all. Well, I mean, yeah, I suppose oil, I mean, and all that sort of stuff, but
yeah. So yeah, that's kind of the big thing. That piece of research blew my mind, though, that the oil lobby.
yeah, no, that's crazy. But what about the mushrooms?
I actually learned. You what? Sorry.
What about the mushrooms? You said something about. You said mushrooms are more like animals than they are like plants.
Okay, so right, plants feed themselves through photosynthesis, so they convert sunlight into sugar and energy. Mushrooms and animals eat things. So what mushrooms kind of do in terms of getting their energy is they break down like forest material, because if they weren't there, then like nothing would be decaying like the plants, and getting rid of them to clear off that kind of generation of fauna and create a basis for new plants to grow. So fungi eat rather than photosynthesize. In fact, what we know of fungi, like the mushroom cap, isn't most of the fungi. That's the reproductive bit of the fungi. That's the bit with the spores in. The most of it is underground, and is like little networks of mycelial stuff.
It's the reproductive bit.
That's what? Sorry.
That's the reproductive bit. That's
yeah.
I don't think I'm ever going to eat mushrooms the same way again.
No, I know, it changes the way you do it, doesn't it?
Maybe I'll just grind that up, turn it into a little mash. Try not to think about
that. And as has just been said in the chat, coal only exists because the shrooms hadn't worked out how to eat wood yet. That's absolutely true. The only reason that there was, coal is really, really, really old wood, before fungi had evolved. Fun thing about fungi in terms of plants and evolution, one of the first species to dominate before animals did and before plants really did was fungi, and they had created structures that are bigger than 2-story buildings at that point in development of history. So that's like very, very early. But yeah. So that's fungi.
kind of terrified, to be honest.
I don't want to live in a giant mushroom world. Like, as much as I want to create new bases for life and all that kind of cool stuff, nah.
Especially just thinking that mushrooms are like the reproductive organ. I don't know, like we just sort of I don't know, I'm never gonna look at a mushroom the same way again now after this conversation.
Pretty much is just like I've seen images of these things, right? And you know how they kind of have like the big
no, I know exactly. They've got certain certain ones that look very
have that. They're just giant big
cucumbers.
Yeah.
I'm getting squeamish. The Irish Catholics coming at me now. Okay. Right. Well, I'm suitably awkwarded out by all of this.
But I mean, to go on to the communist mode of production stuff, right?
Please.
To do that, we need an internet, which is like the biggest contradiction of the whole thing in some ways, because of the kind of energy requirements of that. So at present, I think it's 12. No, I can't remember the statistic. It's a very small amount of. It sounds like a small amount, but it's the same size as the entire aviation industry to hold up the internet as it stands. We would need to expand that under communism so everyone had access to the internet, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to have a global democracy, unless you had kind of decentralized servers. But again, that would have to change kind of some of it. But yeah, so we need to expand the internet quite considerably, and particularly in the oppressed world. So that is a kind of contradiction that we'd have to work out. And I think that's worth noting some of them. The kind of ability to do this at speed is a difficult one. And this is kind of where the fundamental limitations of the environmental crisis come into play, and how we tell if it's too late, because there is an objective measure of that, unfortunately. So at the moment, I think it's 16 of the world's 17 most diverse ecosystems are located in Asia, Africa, and what is now called Latin America, but the Southern Americas. And that is a really important thing to know, because the global south is also going to be the worst impacted by climate change the fastest. And so if those ecosystems are lost, then we can't do it. And that's the really important thing to note about that. So really, the key thing that comes out of this is that the oppressed world has to become the center of the world, the communist world politic as well. So as we've seen in the way that the revolution traveled following the Bolshevik Revolution, it traveled into the oppressed world rather than into the imperialist world, as Lenin had initially expected. It needs to happen fast, and it needs to happen rapidly in the oppressed world. I mean, the fight against imperialism really is going to be the defining fight in terms of whether or not this is possible. So I think that's a really important takeaway to me as well, just to kind of put on some key limitations there and kind of explain where it becomes not possible to do this.
Trotskyist vibes, permanent revolution. took a detour there. There's a couple of Trotskyists in the chat there. Shout out to our Trotskyist friends. Brilliant. Thank you very much.
As long as they don't denounce us as kind of supporting decayed worker states or anything at the moment, then that's fine.
Yeah. Degenerated worker states. That's the big slogan.
Is it a worker state or not?
How can we even say it's a worker state at that stage? Yeah. Okay. Brilliant. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Really, really interesting, and I'm actually quite hopeful as well. The future of hemp. Mushrooms. Try not to think too much about the mushrooms. It looks bright. It looks bright. There's a lot to look forward to there. I might give you a couple of Q&As. I do need to run to the bathroom. It's that sort of time in the stream. We're approaching like an hour and a half into it, and that's the time when I usually feck off for a minute.
I kind of need a bathroom break as well.
Okay, that's slightly. Well, let me see if there's a Q&A that I can take personally. I'll let you go to the bathroom first, and then I'll vibe.
Thank you very much.
You go. Yeah, you go do your thing, and I'll have a little look and see if there's anything good in here. Let me just see what people are saying here. Trotskyist friends, that's what Michael F's saying. The Trotskyists are okay. They're there's a lot. Actually, the Trotskyists are like the dominant trend in the socialist movements in Ireland. So we have to be nice. We have to be nice. they're everywhere. And my area as well. There's just fucking loads of them. It's a hotbed for them. So anyway. Oh, it's Walter saying ye. There's one of our Trotskyist friends jumping out there. Let me see if there's a good question, a good Q&A for me. There aren't that many good questions for me because, to be honest, I don't know that much about this particular topic. So we're going to have to wait for Prolekult, for James to get back from the bathroom to do this. Oh, some random guy asked, Paul, could you re-upload your streams as podcasts, please? Yeah, so I was doing that for a little while. It turns out that it takes me a really, really long time to do the podcast. It takes like a day to take these and convert them to podcasts. It's not just as simple as just like ripping the audio. There's like a whole process of like editing the audio and like shortening it down, add an introduction, add an outro, add music, all that sort of thing. And like it takes like a full like day of work to do that, and unfortunately I just don't have the time to do that at the moment. Quindy question mark exclamation mark question mark, his channel, or excuse me, I don't know the pronouns, their channel anyway, has a few like shortened versions of the stuff that you see here, so go ahead and subscribe to them. Quindy space question mark exclamation mark question mark, and they've got some shortened down versions of these. I'm not sure if that's helpful at all, but go ahead and check that out anyway for some shortened down versions. At least they're sort of dealing with these streams after the fact, which unfortunately I just don't have the time for at the moment, so I apologize for that, comrade. Let me see if I can see some good questions here. All right, I'm gonna take down a few questions because these are good questions for James about hemp. Let me take these down here. There's some cool questions actually about the drug war and hemp and mushrooms, which I think could be quite interesting. A couple of interesting questions about China, natural cycles, nuclear versus biofuels. there's a lot of good stuff here, so I'm looking forward to jumping into this.
Hello.
Hey, you're back.
Yes.
There's the man. Okay, brilliant. We've got a bunch of questions for you. Got a load of great ones. A load of great ones. I've
Cool.
got them all written down here. You know what I might do is, do you have our little shared Google Doc open at the moment?
I'll just grab it. Give me a second.
Yeah, I'm just gonna paste a few questions in there so you can see them. It's just at the very bottom of our shared doc, and you can sort of just work your way through them as you want.
Okay, cool.
Okay.
Cool.
Yeah, so you can see here, it'll be like a name, then it'll say like at Paul Moran. That's just so people know that I'm to answer this live. So yeah, the first one here is Prolekult. Ask Prolekult his take on multipolarity. That's actually from Quinty, the comrade who I was just shouting out there and recommending a moment ago. So do you want to talk a little bit about multipolarity?
Yeah, sure.
Cool. I'm going to run to the bathroom while you do that.
So I've talked about multipolarity a couple of times in relation to imperialist crisis. So we do live in a multipolar world that isn't as kind of segmented into alliances as it was in the so-called Cold War. It is divided between a number of different powerhouses, and there are newer powers on the rise as well. So obviously you have the United States and NATO. NATO is breaking down in a number of ways. Whether or not the Biden administration will be able to reverse that, as is the kind of aim of the Biden administration, I suppose, is probably the way to put it. Whether or not they'll be able to do that, however, is very doubtful. Things like sanctions on Nord Stream 2, things like bipartisan kind of approaches to Iran, as particularly appear to be the case now, and splits within with the European Union are quite set in stone in some ways. The development of a European army is something that's very much happening. And then there's the big kind of change, which is that the United States is no longer the European Union's largest trading partner. China is the European Union's largest trading partner now. And so that alliance isn't going to work in the way it has previously. So things like, so that kind of alliance is breaking down. Competition is emerging within it. We can see that with regard to smaller actors already. So, for example, Turkey and the role that Turkey has played in the Aegean Sea recently, the conflict between Turkey and Greece, the kind of neo-Ottoman push to grab land from Greece, the kind of role that's playing is a destabilizing one in NATO. France as well has recently, just this week, sent warships to the South China Sea, not just to do what it normally does in supporting NATO exercises, but also to sort of more closely ally with China. Even with regard to the kind of British relationship to the United States, that's breaking down, right? Like the extent of the imperialist relations breaking down is astonishing. And so when we're talking about multipolarity, we're talking about imperialist competition, basically, right? We're talking about competition not just between two set blocks. We're talking about imperialist competition between old quote-unquote allies. The basis for that is that as profitability breaks down, capitalism is a hostile brotherhood, and hostile brothers turn on all of each other. And so what I think multipolarity represents more than anything is more common to the contradictions that plagued the world before the First and Second World War than anything we saw in the Cold War, right? It's much more common, has much more in common with that. However, it is set upon a new basis where the capital that unites and tears apart these imperialist powers is much more integrated than it ever has been before. It's much more coupled together through transnational companies and all these kind of things. And what that produces is an increasingly unstable, chaotic security environment where alliances can't really form as anything other than temporary measures. You have the imperialists kind of rationalizing that through what they call hybrid or grey zone warfare. Grey zone warfare is probably the more interesting concept there. It's the idea that you can have warlike maneuvers that land on the boundary between peace and war, and so wage conflict against each other just below the threshold of an out-and-out war. How far that definition has been pushed is astonishing, because Turkey's drone war on Armenia in the latter part of last year, which I must stress was, if you look at the footage, a full-scale war with people being bombed around the capital of Armenia, barely talked about in the Western press. That saw NATO pitted against itself. That saw Russia take the side of NATO actors against Turkey. That saw all these different contradictions come to the fore, because everything is now a calculation based on a specific conflict in a specific geographic region of the world. Turkey and NATO will fight against each other one moment, then unite them one moment. NATO members will fight against each other one moment, then unite one moment. There is no unity across like any of this stuff. And so what multipolarity represents is just really the disintegration of the nation state in a lot of ways. It's the disintegration of the nation state as a coherent body capable of acting in logical, defined ways, and the breakdown of everything into interest chasing and that form of imperialist competition. So what that's done is it's raised the kind of imperialist competition that we saw rising up before the First World War to a qualitatively new level, essentially, where all these things play out in very strange ways, with very temporary alliances. That's incredibly difficult to predict where it'll go. Personally, I think all we can say is it represents another extinction process, right? Like that all of this is just representing an intensification of competition on a burning world that, like, frankly can't sustain it. When we saw the United States was escalating to have an open war with Iran at one point last year before COVID really hit. And we had the UN say that like the world could not sustain an Iran-US war. And they didn't mean that in just a kind of sort of stereotypical statement-y way. What they meant there was like, we can't like have that because every alliance will be set on fire and everything will fall apart, and it doesn't, who knows when that'll go nuclear. Israel would love the opportunity to nuke Iran. Like, you know, these are really serious escalations enmeshed in huge numbers of kind of alliances. And that's really, so multipolarity has weakened the imperialists in one sense, but it's also set them, when the imperialists get weak, they get more violent. And that's really kind of the point of that. So yeah, I think that's quite an important one to highlight. Thank you for asking that.
Really interesting question, and really good answer. Really good answer. Thank you very much for that, comrade. Oh, there's a little bit of an echo there.
Did you want me to come in on any of the other things there?
There's a load of other questions which are really interesting, and we can definitely come to them. Maybe we'll take one more, and then we'll push forward with our questions. We can probably take one or two more. I don't think there's any mad rush or anything like that. Jusqu'ici tout va bien, says Paul Morin. As part of its climate goals, China has called for a 50% reduction in animal product consumption. Does Prolekult have any opinions on how agriculture should be tackled?
Yes, agriculture should be abolished.
No more agriculture. We're done with that.
So agriculture refers to a very specific kind of farming that intends to grow very specific crops and is very water intensive. And like, you know, the Sahara Desert, there's substantial enough evidence to suggest now that like the Sahara Desert didn't exist before agriculture, and agriculture may have caused it. Oh, wow. Like, yeah, it's not, I wouldn't say it's just agriculture, because there's a magnetic pole shift that happens around that time that could also have contributed it. The way that the magnetic poles work changes the environment too. But like, that is a really, really, that's a very serious potential there, and like is a really important point to kind of take up with regard to agriculture. Similarly, like agriculture, like when we're talking about different crops growing alongside each other, we're not really talking about agriculture in some ways. Like we're talking about like garden farming and things like that. And so and horticulture and permaculture, which are the more important pursuits to go through. So we want like forest gardening and things like that, to be able to reinstate those relations rather than simply kind of agriculture, my opinion.
Okay,
I'm
brilliant.
seeing someone in the chat saying that the Sahara Desert thing is factually wrong. That might be the case. If I am wrong on that, I'm happy to retract that.
A little bit of a on-the-go self-crit there.
I'm happy to be wrong. Like, if I'm wrong about something, just tell me and I'll happily retract it on any case.
Maoist James comes out. Thank you very much. Great stuff. This will probably be a quick one, and then we'll push forward a little more, and then towards the end we'll do like a full Q&A section. We can just power through everything. ZB asked a little while ago, what are Prolekult's thoughts on Labour's 2019 manifesto environmental policy?
I mean, my thoughts on the whole of Labour's 2019 manifesto was that it's social democratic gibberish that isn't quite mild even with regard to like social democracy. With regard to its environmental policy, from my memory, they pledged to create some cars and to plant some trees and to the Green Industrial Revolution. So the Green Industrial Revolution has the same problems as the Green New Deal. The problem with the car thing we've been over is like electrical cars don't actually solve the environmental problem because they still require both the extract of new minerals, the cobalt required, as I said earlier, I believe, to be more than actually exists, even for just Britain. And then you also have the fact that all of that will come from imperialist exploitation. So like, where else is Britain going to get its minerals from? Because Britain doesn't have many. And we do have is a huge amount of mining companies that Labour never once mentioned. So that's kind of my stance on that, really. It didn't go anywhere near far enough. Didn't approach the problem, ultimately.
Scathing critique.
Stereotypical of Labour's form of social democracy, isn't it? Exploit the oppressed world and everything will be fine.
Social fascism. I don't know.
I think it's worth mentioning that like the Labour Party have always been much more bloodthirsty than even the Tories when it comes to imperialism. Like, it was a Labour MP who led a round of applause in Parliament when Connolly was murdered. So,
fucking Christ.
Arthur Henderson. Is the name.
All right, don't get me started on social imperialism. Sorry to go. I'm gonna go off on a mad one. I've been pretty mild today, so I don't know. I don't want to go off on a. I don't want to go off on a mad, like, frothing at the mouth rant. So yeah, we'll leave it there. Up Connolly, long live Connolly. That's all I'll say.
Aye, exactly.
Thank you very much. Great stuff. Community, we talked a little bit about how socialism and communism can prevent climate catastrophe. Now, there's one issue, and you touched on this at the end of We Demand Tomorrow, your documentary series. I'm not sure if that's actually the right title. I'm not sure if I said that correctly. We Demand. Is it We Demand Tomorrow? Is that the name of the title?
Yes, that is.
We Demand Tomorrow. Okay. Thank you for clarifying that. I didn't want to mess that one up too much. It's a very important documentary. Please, everybody in the chat, check this out. One of the things that you mentioned is that there are massive problems with infighting on the left. We're so fractured. So do you have any suggestions, any thoughts or ideas for how the communist movement can overcome its internal sectarianism and unite to actually make these things happen? To make communism happen, lower stage and higher stage communism actually come to be,
I think the first thing is to kind of like acknowledge materially where we are as a left here in the West. Because I think that's kind of like a big problem, right? Like, it's a hard question because there's not any one solution. But first, starting with that kind of material context. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the miners' strike in Britain, the attacks of Reaganism in the United States, that process that unfolded through the 1980s, most of the working classes fighting institutions in the imperialist nations were completely destroyed, and in the West were completely destroyed, or sold out and purged their proletarian content. What that left us with were small groupings of largely culturally aligned communists who, like, have decent politics in some instances, in some other instances are not particularly decent, but don't really have a relation to any sizable proletarian force. That's not the truth universally, but that is the general character of the left in the West these days. That doesn't make those things bad either. That's an important thing to stress, but it does mean that they have incredibly slim resources, which means that the factionalism is intensified because they're essentially fighting for influence over very scant resources to keep themselves going and to keep each tendency alive, which really intensifies the contest between those tendencies. That's also kind of a material symptom of a real change in class composition that's really difficult to get around. That what Marx understood the proletariat as having revolutionary potential for was partially that it was industrial. And with the deindustrialization of most of the workforce, and particularly in the imperialist nations, we don't have direct hands on the mode of production anymore. We don't have direct hands on the factories anymore. We don't have huge concentrations of industrial workers who can lie around that. And that kind of creates a class composition power that means that struggle becomes sort of cultural and factional in that kind of direct way that it previously hadn't been. So what you tend to have there is you tend to have these kind of moments where people do come together and that sectarianism is overcome when masses of people burst into action. An example would be the riots that gripped the United States following the murder of George Floyd last year. But when they have to resolve themselves in political policies and political positions, they fall apart, if that makes sense. They can't quite do that. Now, that's also exacerbated by internet culture, which turns everything into a cultural contest in a very direct way, where you're competing for influence among kind of defined spheres which are set there by algorithms and so on and so forth. That makes the sectarianism worse. So there is all these like real material reasons that like these things happen. There are also hot button issues, right, that come up over and over and over and over and over again, that the Western left isn't going to persuade anyone to our cause by debating. And I think that's a really important thing to note, that because we're doing this all in kind of internet spheres, more increasingly so, because organizations engage with each other so little these days, like in actual kind of theoretical contest, what we end up having is very public debates about things that are to do with very dense theoretical matters that we're not going to resolve on the internet, but we're just going to have these questions come up again and again and again, and it becomes a cultural battle for influence within the left. And then you're not going to persuade, people who are living hard up on benefits that the most important question confronting them is China, for example. It's just not going to happen.
The people, you knock on people's doors and the first thing they ask you is China imperialists.
Yeah,
can we consider it socialism if we haven't abolished the commodity form? That's what every normal working class person asks me when I go talk to them. I don't know where you're living, but
but it's the debate that happens like literally every day on the left. And we all have our own wheelhouse in that debate. I don't comment on it in public because I'm not going to change the character of China even if I have the correct position. I'm not going to make China's character wrong by having a different position. I'm not, I don't have any influence in China. China's not what I should be analyzing as a communist in Britain. I should analyze it, but then you have to think, how fortuitous is this? And is it going to persuade people to the cause of the proletariat if they're not in the communist circles, if they don't already culturally identify as a communist? Is this going to bring people toward communism? And the answer is no. Like, because even when people are discussing pro-China positions, they're not like lauding the achievements, for example. They're just using certain like moral positions, frankly, to critique people who disagree with them and to turn it into like this kind of infight. Um, that's not conducting propaganda and agitation. That's getting into a squabble. Um, so I think that's really kind of one thing I think is really important. And this is not a problem that's like new. In the 1930s, one of the reasons that we lost to fascism in Germany and in Italy was because we talked about the Soviet Union and the politics of democracy more than we talked about the economic crisis, more than we talked about the actual context in which we exist and what was going to happen to the proletariat in those nations. And that is really the core to me, is that we need to focus on actual movement building. We need to focus on actually analyzing the economic contradictions that arise in our societies. And that doesn't rule out doing these things. But if people want to have a contest about China, then do it in long form, because there's no point in sending a tweet. You're only making it a moral thing at that point, in my opinion. And that's the other thing, is that to overcome these things, you need to have long form debate, because Marxism is a science, and science can only actually occur if you're doing it in long form debate. And science can only actually occur if you're referring to material phenomena. Like it can't actually occur otherwise. And so we need a scientific standard of literature. And if something is below that scientific standard of literature, we don't respond to it theoretically because it doesn't warrant it. Like,
oh, I absolutely agree. I mean, like so many of like as you said, it's this moral. It's a kind of a moralism when it comes to a lot of these kind of topics. Like, I like such and such a country; they're doing good things, so therefore they must be socialists. They must be the saviors of the world proletariat, and so on and so forth. Just because they did like one good thing, and like there actually is concrete evidence that we can look at. There actually is, like, there have been studies, there have been polemics, of course, as well. But there is actual statistical evidence there that we can look at with regard to all these kinds of questions, and maybe like a 280 character tweet isn't the place for thoroughly engaging in the scientific socialist process.
Yeah, because all it does is so for example, there are a lot of like organizations that are formed through these online kind of debate spheres as well these days. Like it may just be an online debate in terms of how it manifests, but it stops people from working with each other, right? Like, and you can have principled disagreements with each other and not work with each other or talk to each other.
Oh yeah, no, definitely.
And
I totally agree. Actually, in my own organization, Connolly Youth Movement, shout out to comrades in Connolly Youth Movement. Like, there are people on both sides of the whole China question, and it's not an issue when it comes to actually organising. Just not a problem at all. Of course, we discuss and we debate amongst ourselves, but it's just not an issue in terms of actual like real world organising and getting shit done. So it doesn't need to be treated as though it's like this massive antagonistic contradiction at every second of every minute of every hour of every day. Just sleep, lead a normal life. Get off Twitter.
Yeah, quite. But I think that applies in a number of ways as well. Like, so we have that on the one hand with the internet left, but then we also have the kind of offline left, which doesn't talk to each other anymore. Like, people from different organizations. I can't remember the last time I saw a spirited debate occur within a journal, if that makes sense. And that's actually really important, because like Lenin wouldn't have developed his ideas on the class struggle in Russia if he hadn't been having to persuade and argue with people in long form. Marx wouldn't have like developed his critique of anarchism and his the start of scientific socialism if he hadn't been jousting with Proudhon. Like,
the only ones I've actually seen doing that are the Maoists. The Maoists are seem to be doing that. Like, I'm not sure if you remember, but like I think there was a statement by the CPP, MPA, the communists in the Philippines, and I think they may have given some sort of, not full support, but like some sort of kind of tacit support for Joe Biden in the recent election. And then I think the Tribune of the People came out quite strongly against this, calling it kind of like an opportunist position and so on and so forth. It is actually happening amongst some spheres. I think the Maoists are still kind of engaging in that kind of dialogue which
Yeah.
but that's the only space I can kind of see it actually happening. So
Yeah, and I think that the key thing to highlight there is that that's not the Western left ever, is it? It's more
yeah,
kind of the kind of a left in the oppressed world, which I have to say as well, like the left in the oppressed world tends to talk about these things more because they get shot if they don't.
real legit politics, yeah.
So yeah, I just think it's a kind of important point to make that perhaps shouldn't be given undue significance, but one way to kind of overcome sectarianism to get like a healthy culture of debate going.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely.
and to understand that disagreement doesn't mean kind of like denouncing. Similarly, I think like the other things I think are coming back to that kind of class composition problem, which is the more problematic element of it in the West and the imperialist nations, I think, in that who are we trying to organize is a really difficult question sometimes. Like, you know, there's an analysis that suggests the so-called precariat, or just like, which is just realistically like, you know, people who don't have stable jobs, which capitalism has only really provided a very small section ever. But, you know, that kind of small kind of app-based workforce provides a new revolutionary kind of structure. And the problem with that is kind of no, in some ways, because like, yes, some of those workers are revolutionaries and the organizing that's happening there is really good. But in terms of constituting a broad class basis, like a lot of those people don't want to be employed in those jobs. They don't want to like remain a delivery person. They don't want to remain an Uber driver. They view it as a temporary employment thing. They similarly like a lot of people in those kind of jobs are kind of a very strange mixture of class bases. You've got people there from the kind of the proletarianized youth of the labor aristocracy who are being forced into a more broader proletarian circumstance, but still hold certain class viewpoints that aren't proletarian. Similarly, you have kind of much poorer elements of the workforce within those kind of things who've never had stable employment. But those kind of cultural bases don't tend to result in much organizing a lot of the time, because as sad as it is, work is the one area of our lives most of the time that people have to come into contact with people they don't like. Like, and that's not a solid base for organizing. It's a really difficult question. And I think that the lack of a real class force is in many ways a kind of explanation for the sectarianism of the left, because aside from kind of these other niche questions, the big thing that always comes up is what people refer to as identity politics, which isn't identity politics. It's certain specific oppressed people within the composition of the proletariat advancing certain interests and being attacked by social chauvinists because they don't constitute the whole proletariat. But how you unite a proletariat that is increasingly divided culturally into certain interest groups is a really hard question. And the sectarianism and the bitterness that arises on the left is a reflection of that. So really, it's a class composition question, I think, at the end of the day, how we overcome sectarianism and kind of unite around political policies is a matter of movement building. And when we have a movement, it will fall away because the stakes will be higher.
So you say it's a class composition issue. How do you see that sort of resolving moving forward, or do you see any kind of resolution for that?
So there's two kind of things that are kind of happening. The first is what we sort of the question we had earlier in the stream relating about whether or not the environmental crisis can form a unifying point. It can happen, and the relationship to the earth, it should be a unifying point for masses of human people in the future, and masses of the oppressed in the future. It could also let in liberalism, so we need to be very clear in the context that when we're talking about sectarianism, we're not talking about batting the liberals out and getting rid of their ideas, because I maintain that is the only thing you can do with the liberal, is get rid of them. So there's that element, and then the other element of it is we're going to see the proletariat is going to fall into much more kind of dispossession than has ever been there before. So the unity that can be formed is the unity around dispossession, I believe. That's very hard to do, and has only ever really been achieved by not small, by some groups. I think the most famous would be the Black Panther Party in the United States. But unity around dispossession is very hard. Analyzing the lumpen proletariat is a really important task that, frankly, hasn't really satisfactorily been done yet, but is a really important start. And finally, kind of understanding that how localized and isolated these struggles are can only be sort of gotten rid of by putting forward a position of advance and not just defensive struggles, which is what we've really been doing in a lot of the imperialist nations in the West since the 2008 financial crash. Like, people have been organizing around benefit cuts and things like that in Britain for the entire time that I've been on the left in Britain. And as necessary as that struggle is, and absolutely important as that struggle is, and I would advise anyone organize around defending benefit claimants, because it's a really good way to kind of get involved in mass work. As important as that is, it's not inspiring for anyone involved, because at the end of the day, you're defending an economic right that has a basis in a system that most claimants hate. Yeah. Like, most people who claim JSA hate JSA. Most people who claim disabled benefits hate disabled benefits. And, we need a position of advance, and that really requires being a bit more ambitious and saying, like, look, this is what we would do if we had a proletarian state. This is what's possible. And, talking about what communism could be and the material basis of it, which is, I suppose one of the main reasons why we made We Demand Tomorrow is kind of get a bit more kind of optimism and foresight into the left.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, comrade. I really, really appreciate that. Fantastic. Yeah, we need a little bit of foresight and a little bit more optimism looking forward and figuring out how we're going to manage things as we go. Are you okay with taking a few more Q&As now? I think now might be a good time to power through. We can probably do it. We can probably do a full Q&A section now if that works for you.
Yeah, that's great.
Cool. Can I just ask, time-wise, how are you set? Do you have a little bit of time? Are you rushing off, or are you good to go for?
No, I'm not rushing off. I can probably give maybe half an hour, 45 minutes at most.
Perfect. Okay, grand. So we'll do half an hour, 45 minutes more Q&As, and then we'll fire ahead with those. Cool. Thank you very much, comrade. Okay, so I believe you answered the question, ZB's question about Labour's 2019 manifesto's environmental policy. The next question I can see here is Death to Mockingbirds, who asked two questions. I'll read them both out. Death to Mockingbirds. First one, Paul, opinions on fisheries collapse. And the other question that this comrade had was, though Prolekult recommends local democracy for this, it seems it would need to be planned at the global level. No, I think this is when you were talking about stuff like permaculture. You were sort of talking about solutions and how we can move forwards. So that's probably from a very specific moment in the conversation. I'm not sure if you wanted to touch on this, if you wanted to touch on the question about local democracy versus global, dealing with these problems globally and how that might play out on a day-to-day basis. So that and the fisheries question. I'm not sure if you want to, in what way you want to take those.
So the fisheries collapse is kind of, I'm assuming that refers to the decline in fish stock in the North Atlantic more than anything. Correct me if I'm wrong in that, if there's been a big development around fisheries that I've missed. The ocean's health is not good. We're reaching a point where I think it's salmon is kind of nearing extinction. We've got a few kind of fish in the North Atlantic that are nearing extinction. It's bad. It can only be stopped by communism. In terms of the local democracy question, so communism, right? Capitalism has a long-term tendency to monopolize production and draw it toward a global kind of concentration. Communism has a long-term tendency to decentralize production and to put it back in the hands of local communities. So on the one hand, the solution is both global and local, which is why I would lay so much stress on the internet being like a fundament of this. So basically, whilst we see permaculture and all these kind of things being implemented, you would have the internet as a global democratic network to share these developments, to show where they might be applicable. However, as we said, like ecosystems are concrete things that happen in concrete locations, and so the way in which each individual system would develop would need to be localized. And so what you would have is, over time, you would be developing more and more localized forms of production so communities can be self-sufficient. That would be enmeshed in a global democratic infrastructure and in a kind of global society that would be able to divert resources and things like that where people aren't capable of producing those things. That's how I kind of view that question, is that localized democracies would be integrated into the whole, and the whole would be integrated into localized democracies as it kind of develops. It would manifest as a tendency to decentralize production, if that makes sense.
Makes sense. Thank you very much. Brilliant. The next one I just see there, a recent one just came in from Ben Redward, says the ruling class will use geoengineering to keep doing business as usual. Once that stops working and socialists seize power, what can be done then?
Oh, bro. Geoengineering is a really interesting question that I'm still researching on. I don't know how possible it is, though, right? Like, without them, like, so the advantage of the communist solution is that we're not talking about this being left to machines. We're talking about this being a mass people's effort, a global people's effort in a struggle against environmental destruction and the vestiges of capitalism. We're talking about this being a global people's struggle to bring humanity back into communion with nature. We're talking about a global people's struggle to build a renewable, restorative mode of production. Whereas geoengineering is machines trying to maintain an habitable climate to keep us all alive. Some of that technology will end up being integrated into the socialist mode of production. I have no doubt about that. Into the communist mode of production, I have no doubt about that. But I don't think it would work on its own, frankly. So I think the terms of the struggle are the same as we've kind of talked about throughout this stream, is that we need to be aiming for that communist restorative mode of production with the production of productive ecosystems and the the use of plant-based infrastructure.
Yeah, communism or bust.
Yeah, pretty much.
Thank you very much, comrade. Next up, Alex. Paul, what are Prolekult's thoughts on nuclear versus biofuels? Is nuclear fusion a science fiction, or is it actually a realistic future?
I don't know about nuclear fusion. What I would say is, right, there are a number of emerging technologies that could provide potential fuels, potential new internet infrastructures. Like, we're talking about quantum internets in some parts of the world, right? It's mad. But at the same time, we've destroyed everything. We haven't fixed any of it. Maybe we should not invest in speculative technologies and instead in really investigate, the plants, the algae, the fungi that have created the basis for life in this planet in the first place. They're a tried and true method that we know can work, before going to those things. I think thorium could be used as a fuel to phase out some of the fossil fuels because it's less water intensive. It's more renewable. It still does rely on extraction in the end point, though. You still have to extract thorium and use it for that nuclear power. So, I think it will have a use. I'm not a big nuclear advocate, though, at the end of the day, personally.
Thank you very much, comrade. Brilliant. Next up, Death to Mockingbirds. Friend of the show at this stage. If you could ask, Paul, could a complete decoupling with natural cycles, indoor farming, be prioritized before restoration?
No. The reason for that is quite simply that we need that diversity of ecosystems to be able to do this. So there's a really important fact about the Amazon rainforest, rainforests in general, that the key is the amount of biomass we have, right? So the Amazon rainforest and other rainforests have become carbon emitters rather than carbon sinks through the process of farming and all these kind of other things. So if you have them there without replenishing them, without creating that ecological diversity outside en masse, then what you end up creating is actually a situation where those kind of circumstances are left to run amok. So we really need to get right out there in the muck of it as quickly as possible as a mass, in my opinion. I don't think there's an easy way to have indoor farming work. It is obviously there if we kind of get to a point where it becomes too late, and we need to preserve certain species from extinction, to try and reforest them, to regrow them at certain other points when we've managed to stabilize things. That could be there as a backup, and I wouldn't oppose it in that sense. I don't oppose indoor farms per se, but I would never prioritize them above the restorative mode of production we require.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Next up here is Major Hydraulic, says Paul, or excuse me, asks, Paul, is the drug war why we haven't seen the use of hemp or mushrooms in useful ways?
Yes, in a way, but in the way that the drug war was partially created by imperialism for two reasons. One was certainly in pursuit of that criminalization of these drugs to prevent them from, taking the place of oil. Actually, an interesting fact I learned, aside from the criminalization of marijuana, I learned this quite recently. Diesel cars were originally designed to run on peanut oil, and the guy who designed them mysteriously died. Yeah.
He died of a heart attack.
So, well, he just, I don't, he died. Yeah. Don't want to say why, but I think we can all take the implication. And diesels were redesigned to only take a more damaging fuel at that point. So they were originally designed to be much more ecologically friendly than other cars, which I think is quite an important point with regard to that. The other reason why the drug war was promoted, of course, is because drugs are a pillar of the international banking system, and a lot of the banks that we dominate the world, would go bust if it wasn't for the drug trade that they completely and utterly perpetuate through imperialist war and conquest as well, which they use through the CIA. Obviously, for example, used it to soften up to create drug conflicts in the context of the Black Panther Party, to stop that radical movement. All these kind of things. So drugs play a huge role of kind of allowing imperialist domination to continue, and financially are one of four pillars of the international banking system as well.
Wow, that's before we get into like the sort of 13th Amendment stuff of locking people up, to perform basically slave labor. When you look at like it's crazy in the US in particular. It's just absolutely insane, like how many people they have. What is it? They have like 25% of the incarcerated population in the entire world, and they've only got like 3% of the population, something like that. Just absolutely mental.
Yep.
And,
I mean, they've got full on basically. Full on slave labor in their industrial prisons. You see things like at the moment, it's just absolutely disgusting. You've got White Rittenhouse shoots people. Does he become a slave? No. Black people carry a tiny bit of marijuana. In you go for as long as we can possibly keep you
25
here.
years.
Disgusting. Yeah.
Oh, it's crazy. Absolutely crazy. Thank you very much. Still on the drugs topic here. We've got You'll Have a Stroke Reading This asks, Paul, can we talk a bit more about hemp? Like hemp transistors, hemp steel. That shit is awesome. I love that. But would you mind talking a little bit more about hemp transistors and hemp steel? That sounds
I
really
mean,
badass.
hemp steel is stronger than actual steel. That's
That's great. You
a
could have like
really
could you have like a hemp sword? You could have hemp sword fights.
you could have hemp sword
What
fights, and
the
they'd be like
fuck?
more more dangerous than like just a steel sword. You have a
Jesus
sword
Christ.
fight with a hemp steel fight in the
Double
steel, and the
cut you.
hemp steel cuts through the steel.
Oh my god. Cut through and then uncut
uh,
through and cut through again. Jesus Christ.
hemp Henry Ford made a hemp car.
Uh oh.
That's the thing that happened.
Well, there's trouble.
Um,
He brought in Henry Ford.
he made it.
Famous friend of the
Um,
fascists.
yes, famous friend of the fascists.
Hemp
Uh,
fascist confirmed.
oh, we didn't actually touch on eco-fascism yet, but
Oh, that'd be a good one to touch on, actually. I'm not sure if you wanted to use this as an opportunity to segue into something about that. I'm not sure if you want to say anything else about hemp transistors and hemp steel, and then because actually there was one person who asked a question. It's a little bit later on. It was a question that was quite recent. We can probably take it now. It kind of comes in quite nicely from this, and it'll sort of feed into this question. ZB asks, Paul, I have another question for Prolekult. Should humans be having less children? Should there just be less people? Does this relate to Malthus in any way? And,
okay.
do you have anything to say on this particular topic?
I do. Right. So, like, first of all, Malthus was insane. Like, I want to be absolutely clear that
Agreed.
Malthusians are misreading Malthus, and I can't stress that enough. What Malthus says in the principle of population is not that it's just simply we're going to use up so many resources or whatever. He deploys the argument that we're going to run out of space at one point in that pamphlet. Like, Malthus was mad, and Malthus was deeply wrong. The other thing that I would say is the Malthusians today are deeply scary people. David Attenborough's one. And no one likes to talk shit about David Attenborough, but I think we have to. Like, he's
Yeah,
not a nice man. He began his life surveying tribes and talking about them as if they were animals. That's how his career began,
yeah.
and he's
Nice
ending his
voice, but
career.
piece of shit.
Yeah, like, nice voice to advocate the murder of black children with.
Jesus fucking Christ.
That's what he does.
Dropping bombs everywhere, Protocol.
But there's a part in his new documentary where he literally goes, we need to control the population to defend our way of life, and control the population has pictures of black people in it, and our way of life has pictures of white people in it, and it's just so.
Jesus. Wait, that's not our planet, is it?
Yeah,
Or is that a different?
I think it is. Yeah.
Fucking hell! I didn't.
Yeah.
I saw our planet and I thought it was interesting. I thought it was the political solutions that it provided were dog shit. It was a well shot piece of work, but I don't remember that. I don't remember that
Yeah.
scene. But Jesus fucking Christ, that's
It's a very
horrific.
small bit. Like,
So
it might have been a trailer I saw it in, but it's certainly something that his voice was in. And yeah. But in terms of like Malthusianism as well, like, it won't, even if we did that thing where we had reduction in the population and population control, it wouldn't work. First of all, because a massive problem in population demographics is that we have an aging population that can't labor. And so what you would end up with is a society of all elderly people who are then expected to work past their age of retirement and the point where their bodies are packed in, possibly through exoskeletons and things like that. An absolute nightmare, doesn't it? The idea that you get to 60 and you can't, or 80 or whatever it is. I mean, I think Britain, it's 80 now, but you're just not allowed to pack it in. You're not allowed to stop working. You just have to keep working because the species now needs your labor power at that age. That's not a solution in any analysis, let alone the terms that kind of we would set. The other problem with the population control argument is that it misses that, like, it's not the sheer size of the population that's the problem. It's the way we produce things, and particularly the luxury consumption that happens. Like, most of flying is the result of a very small number of people. Most of energy consumption is the result of a very small number of people. Most of resource consumption is the result of a very small number of people. Like, there is a problem with our mode of production, but there's not. It's not that there's too many people.
Yeah, what is it? Even when you just think about like food, it was like 150%. We produce every single day. We produce 150% of the food we need to feed every single person on this planet. So
Mhm.
yeah, we don't we don't need to produce that much. And meanwhile, we still have people starving. But you know,
Yep, and we just let it go to rot.
Jesus. Yeah,
It's
the
quite.
bananas with brown spots on them just get fucking thrown away.
Yep, and like even if it were the case that we had a food problem, then if you got rid of the huge tracts of land that had been carved out for mines and turned them into like workable places to grow food and other things, that wouldn't be a problem anymore, would it? Like you can stop those things, and the solution to it isn't to limit the number of children that people have and to shrink the species, in my opinion.
Agreed. Brilliant. Thank you very much. We'll push on to the next question that we had here. Nicholas Vacano says, Paul, Prolekult's question: is there any way in which strategies for environmental sustainability could be meaningfully integrated into urban settings? Any thoughts on this?
Yes, yeah, there is. There's cities will probably be around for quite a long time after communism because they provide a lot of like really big advantages in terms of like making life fun. Like culture tends to be in cities. Culture tends to be more accessible in cities. All these kind of things are certainly there. But it's also the case that like we have these structures and we live in them already, and huge migrations of people into barren areas is probably not a greatest way to start doing this kind of stuff if we're going to win the political struggle. Um, but yeah, so there are ways to do that. So in Cuba, they have organopanicos, which are city-based farms. You can do things like integrating greenery into the environment through a lot of different ways. Mosses are really a good example of this. I finished a whole book on moss recently that explained how they can grow in the smallest cracks of anything and on stone and all that. And yeah, mosses inhabit cities at a really fast rate. The problem with that is that they also don't have a protective membrane, so they die very quickly because of the carbon emissions and the air pollution in the area. So mosses are being killed. But if we were cutting down on kind of car transport and all that kind of mode of air pollution, then you would start to see the natural environment come into the city very quickly anyway, in my opinion. And the bigger problem would be keeping it out in some ways, I think, if you didn't have all these kind of highways of death and all that air pollution there, then you would be able to integrate nature at quite a high rate. Similarly, you can also do things like garden walls. They're very water intensive though, so probably not the best way to go about it. But there are other things, kind of like the conversion of common green space, which we just use like as lawns now, into gardens and forest areas, would be a huge boon to integrating cities with the environment. Like there are so many areas in cities like that can be turned into productive places where things can grow, like parks. Parks are very ornate and pretty in some areas of cities. More often than not these days, they're actually really run down, but they could be converted into areas where, you can have huge areas of growth and things like that. So yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant. Lots of good suggestions there. Thank you, comrades. Next one is from Dialectical Vegan Egoist. Hilarious name. I love that. Does Prolekult know the Marxist John Bellamy Foster, and what does he think about his works?
I do know John Bellamy Foster. The next book on my list is Marx and the Earth by him and Paul Burkett, and I'm looking forward to reading it. I haven't read masses of his work yet, but I think he did a very good article on Marxism and the indigenous struggle that I really, really suggest comrades read. That was in the monthly review. If you just search Marx and the indigenous struggle, you'll find that. I like some of his work, the parts of his work I've read. I remember having some criticisms of some articles that I'd read a while ago, but I can't remember them off the top of my head, so I don't want to just kind of go off on one without like fully kind of rereading that, remembering.
Thank you. I appreciate the the modesty. Something that's unfortunately sorely lacking on the online left. Just put your hands up and saying, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know that much about it, so I'm not going to speak about it. I could probably learn from that as well. Thank you, comrade Tom.
Oh, we've all done it, though, don't worry, comrade. Like we've all said something and gone, "Oh no, I don't really know about that."
I need to go. I need to learn more about this. Yeah, yeah. There was actually there was a question in the chat that I'm learning more about right now that I've been kind of hesitant to answer because I'm learning more about it right now. Someone asked about whether or not Trump was a fascist, and like, so it's kind of a difficult question to ask because like fascism is a term like socialism. There's about 20 different definitions of it. There's like the popular definition. There's like the fascists themselves. They have their own definition. Mussolini's definition, like the Hitlerite version, and then there's like like the Maoist definition. There's the old common term definition. There's all this different sort of stuff. So yeah, it's something I'm still kind of working on right now and still trying to get to the bottom of. If people have any good readings on it, then please let me know. But I mean, I suppose there's that old commentary definition, which is probably a good one to fall back on, of fascism being the most reactionary elements of finance capital. The alternative of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Within the dictatorship of the proletariat, you can have like a bourgeois democracy, or you can have fascism, the open terrorist dictatorship of the most reactionary elements of finance capital. And so it's either which is fascism. So it's either one or the other. And
I think it's a kind of
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. You go ahead, comrade.
No, you go ahead. I was just going to talk shite some more.
I was just going to say that, like, I call Trump a fascist rhetorically, most of the time, because like we need an agitational standpoint on it, and he is marshalling some of the most reactionary elements of the U.S. society to his side, or was. We'll see how long that goes on for. But I think the key for me is that like the processes of the 20th century don't anywhere look like the processes of the 21st, if that makes sense. Like it's qualitatively different. We're talking about what Trump represents as a class base would meet certain definitions of fascism. So like we're talking about an alliance between a section of the bourgeoisie and the petty bourgeoisie, and particularly like kind of militia elements within the petty bourgeoisie. We're talking about an alliance of militias with the state, which is significant. But Trump's base is derived from lumpen capitalists, who are capitalists who kind of circumvent the law, criminalize or do engage in criminal activity. He's also got a base in kind of realtors. He's got a base in all these kind of nationally based capitals within the United States, these criminal kind of elements of the bourgeoisie there. And also farming capital and small petty bourgeois factions, which is more important to understand than whether or not he's a fascist, right? He represents a reactionary backlash against certain things in defense of US imperialism, and his force does represent a really anti-democratic threat in a lot of ways. At the same time, the opposition to his anti-democratic threat is a different anti-democratic threat. So it's kind of a moot point in some ways. I think what the core thing has to be is that he's the result of a split among the bourgeoisie that is about the tactical direction of US imperialism and nothing else. And neither he nor Biden offer anything to the proletariat. And that's the more important position at the moment than he meets the technical definitions of fascism to me. Because ultimately, like, all of capitalism is an extinction cult right now. Can you qualitatively say like one version of extinction is going to be better than another? It might be like more openly racist, I guess. But yeah. And that's not to downplay the kind of reaction either, because like the United States is a deeply terrifying society and Trump was a terrifying development for some people. But at the same time, he was continuing some processes that Biden set in motion, right? Like he was, Biden started the caging of the children under Obama.
Yeah.
you have all these kind of huge problems with that. So I think that, but the core is the class analysis, which is Trump himself is a lumpen bourgeois, nationally based monopolist. He's not very good at it, which is why he's lumpen bourgeois, which is why he resorts to criminal things. Trump made the only substantial money that he as an individual made when he was in the 1970s, when New York was in ruins, when he was able to buy houses from black people for $1. And that's when he made the money that actually added to his father's empire. Other than that, he just inherited and lost a lot of money. Was very good at avoiding his taxes and engaging in criminal activity. And that's kind of why he was able to do those things. But he's a lumpen bourgeois. He's in alliance with the petty bourgeoisie of the farming industry, which is why soybean exports to China was so important for him. He's in alliance with people in the kind of property industries, all these US industries that are struggling under the neoliberal kind of result, the sections of the US bourgeoisie that are falling apart more rapidly than the rest of it. And he represents their reaction. And I think that's all we need to say, frankly.
No, it's a really, really good take on it. And I appreciate you explaining that to all of us. I think that was really, really useful. Thank you, comrade. Brilliant. The next question I see here is from Tom. Tom asks, if Prolekult could hit a switch and change one or two things about the British left, what would they be? Likewise with the Irish Labour movement. Do you want to take that?
Do you want to go?
I can jump in one or two things, and then you can jump in with that. I would say the first thing I would do is abolish the the 1990 Industrial Relations Act, which basically made all kind of militant labour organising illegal in Ireland, and any kind of even basic stuff like strikes and stuff like that. It's possible, but it's kind of untenable. Realistically, there's just a lot of bureaucratic stuff that you need to do, a lot of hoops that you need to jump through before you're able to do any proper like industrial action. You can't do like sympathetic strikes with other businesses or other shops or other workplaces or whatever it might be. And that's a real spanner in the works for labour organising in Ireland, has been for the last 31 years. So that needs to go. That's the big one. The next big one, so that's the first thing I would say, is abolish the Industrial Relations Act, the 1990 Industrial Relations Act, IRA, which is funny, but and actually ironically linked to, sort of tangentially linked to that. The second thing I would say is that we need to abolish the special criminal courts. The special criminal courts in Ireland are, it's just this ridiculous criminal court system where you're subject to the most ridiculous treatment. Anyone who's involved in any kind of radical political activity just gets basically taken to these courts, and all of your normal democratic rights are suspended. For example, the right to remain silent is suspended when you go into the special criminal courts in Ireland. Like they can infer if you don't say anything, like if you literally don't say anything, if they ask you a question and you don't say anything about it, just exercising the right to remain silent, they can infer from your silence a positive answer based on whatever they want it to be. They don't need to show you what their evidence is against you, so they can just try you based on evidence that you don't even know about. So you go in, you don't even know what you're actually fighting against. It's really barbaric. It's a horrific system that they have in Ireland, and you might even say fascistic in some ways. There actually are some weird fascistic elements in Ireland that people don't really talk about too much. For example, like we have like Seanad Éireann, which is kind of like this corporatist institution, which I think it's kind of probably one of the less distasteful aspects of fascism, of Mussolini style fascism from the 1930s. But yeah, the special criminal courts are super fucked up. They need to go. They absolutely destroy any potential for militant activism in any kind of way, and they're often used in the most despicable manners possible. They'll literally just like pull you into a van and then you're gone for like 3 days. They keep you in here. They don't tell you what you've done. You don't have the right to remain silent. They can use that to infer. They don't even need to. Actually, here's one thing that's really, really interesting. The police can say whatever the fuck they want about you, and that is taken as evidence. So you don't even need to actually provide evidence. A police officer, a Garda, member of Garda Síochána, can just say, I believe this person is involved with such organization, using the most ridiculous evidence they have. For example, let's say you have a poster in your room. Just let's say I had a poster behind me. Let's pretend I don't have like a bookshelf of like radical literature behind me right now. But let's say there's like a poster behind me that says like it's a 1916 Easter Rising poster. They could use that as evidence that I was trying to engage in like armed physical force Republican activity, like trying to overthrow the state. I was going to do like an insurrection or something like that, and they could use that as evidence for that. They could use like a fucking picture that you have on your phone, anything, and all it takes is like a guard to say, I believe this person is going to engage in that, like with no concrete evidence whatsoever. And the Garda's word is taken as gospel in this case, and unfortunately the person, the victim in this case, has no legal recourse to that, and it's super fucked up. The special criminal courts are just one of the most abhorrent things about the Republic of Ireland right now. The Free States, 26 counties, and that's I would abolish that straight away. So that's that the Industrial Relations Act and Special Criminal Court, get rid of them. We don't need them. They're fucked.
I think that's completely and utterly reasonable there, comrade. I mean, obviously, like, circumstance in Ireland is quite different to that in Britain. But like, Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah. You should Google. You should all Google that. Google the Special Criminal Court. There's a very, very good interview actually that the CYM have up with someone who has been through that. So if you just Google Special Criminal Courts, CYM, you'll probably find the interview there. And yeah, I don't want to say too much more, but it'll be pretty enlightening for people who are curious. I might see if I can pull up a little link to it and put it in the chat there.
Yeah, I think that'd be good.
Yeah, I'll pop it. I've got it here. I'm just gonna pop that into the chat. So it's an interesting one.
I think I'm going to read a bit more about that as well, because I mean, I know some Irish history up in like under British rule, because obviously being a British communist, I kind of want to know about the crimes that we the British state committed.
Thank you for committing to doing that. It's important.
But yeah, no, I'd like to know about what's kind of happened beyond that, and obviously as well, like Britain was. Yeah, I mean, Britain's rule in Ireland is kind of a really key part of Britain, really. Like, you know, there's that old propaganda poster about Ireland being Britain's Cuba, and the
I love that. I fucking wish. One day, maybe.
One day, yes, absolutely. On to my response to that would be abolish the British Labour Party and all of its apologists. That would be the first thing I'd change about the British left. On the basis that the British Labour Party are reactionary to their rotten core. Even, you know, I might get some pushback on this, but Lenin was wrong about them when he said that there was a point to getting involved with them. The so-called ultra-leftist Sylvia Pankhurst was correct, and there's never been a role of socialists in the Labour Party, and they've proven that time and time and time and time again. The first proof I would give in kind of reference to that, I love having an excuse to fire off about the Labour Party, I'm not going to lie. The first reason I would give is that they were founded, the class basis is not the mass of the proletariat. It never has been. It has been a slim section of the proletariat that was organized in craft unions at the start of its formation. The craft unions' membership requirements was dues that were more than most people's weekly wages. And so, you know, most people didn't join them. That section is what Lenin referred to as the labour aristocracy. Engels was right when he said that the proletariat in Britain is getting more bourgeois by the day. And, you know, that political section was organised by the British Labour Party. It was tied to imperialism because it was the industrial working class that allowed Britain's empire to function, the so-called workshop of the world in that point. That section of the class, the privileged section. And what that political representation has done is betrayed the international workers' movement at every point in time and repressed anti-imperialist movements in the oppressed world without remorse. I said earlier in the chat about the Labour Party leading a round of applause for the murder of Connolly. That's one of the early examples that we have there. but we also have the founding of work camps for the unemployed in Britain, within Britain, in the 1930s. We have the so-called golden age of the 1945 government, which, having so-called apparently liberated communists interned in Nazi concentration camps, immediately put those communists in torture camps, British torture camps, to head off the Cold War, sent the British Army to put down striking peasants in Malaya, striking rubber workers in Malaya, with force, supported the French in quelling Vietnam, supported the repression in India, supported the repression of people in Ireland in the 45 government. Massive, massive, massive imperialist repression through the British Labour Party. That has always been a truth. And what we got for that was a bribe of a state welfare system that, yeah, the NHS is its crowning achievement. People kind of try to present the privatization of the NHS as a new phenomenon, but it was actually brought in a position that was begun by the same government that founded the NHS, as dentistry was privatized the year after it was nationalized. That was what we got in Britain for the absolute plunder of the colonies. And then you see that tendency is repeated and carried on throughout all of British Labour Party's history. Today, we have the British Labour Party had a brief period where it was so-called socialist tendencies were apparently revived by the Jeremy Corbyn. What Mr. Corbyn did was flaked on every single issue pertaining to imperialism that actually came up. We saw Mr. Corbyn refused to use the whip against airstrikes on Syria. We saw Mr. Corbyn abstain on a motion that would have seen asylum seekers within Britain given the right to work. We saw Mr. Corbyn instruct Labour councils within Britain to make cuts. We saw Mr. Corbyn sign up to NATO, sign up to Trident, all these different things. The Labour Party absorbs masses of the left's energy, if not all of the left's energy within Britain, and it is an imperialist, racist, anti-working class party to its core, and it needs to be destroyed for the left to make any progress here whatsoever, as do all of its apologists. Next, I would say the other thing I would change about the British left would be the anti-trade union laws, where we're not allowed to declare strikes, that strikes have to be legally organized in such a way that makes them generally impossible with majority membership ballots in the trade unions. The trade unions as well is probably a broader point, but I would change the class composition of the trade unions and particularly their leadership, because they, as with the Labour Party, betray the workers' cause at every point. We saw that a very visceral example of that is the Grunwick workers' strike, where migrant workers at a film processing plant in London went on strike, and the Labour movement attacked them at every turn, and the trade union movement in Britain. I guess the core of that is I would abolish social democracy.
Social fascism, you mean?
Yes, I do. On that, actually, if I may fire off about
go on, fire off, please. Navarra. Oh, here we go, spicy take. Let me get the popcorn.
So Navarra Media platform Peter Singer, who, if people don't know, very recently on Aaron Bastani's stream, people don't know who Peter Singer is. He advocates for the murder of disabled children and says that disabled people can't be raped because they can't understand the concept of consent.
You can see it now, Peter Singer. He's a fucking vegan. He's like an eco-fascist guy, is he?
Yes, he is. He's always been an advocate of these things. It's the first thing that would come up if you searched him. And it's the way Aaron Bastani approached Peter Singer was by saying that disabled activists have had some kind of criticisms. He doesn't refer to what those criticisms are, but have criticisms of Peter Singer, doesn't mention what they are, and then lets Peter Singer monologue for 10 minutes. A lot of disabled people have been drawing their attention to this on social media for the last few days, making the point as well that this occurs in the context where the British state is doing a eugenics campaign against disabled people. And what the Navarra eventually responded with does not contain an apology, again doesn't mention that Peter Singer advocates for eugenics, and just says that we are sorry we've hurt disabled people.
Oh, problem solved then.
Problem solved. So yeah, I just kind of wanted to fire off on them because they were apparently left media, but they are the biggest social democratic media in Britain, and they still support the British Labour Party and believe there's a point in remaining in it with Keir Starmer at its head. And frankly, with comrades like that, we don't need a bourgeoisie.
Who needs class enemies? Oh, that's bleak. That's absolutely fucking bleak.
The British left are always bleak.
At least we got you anyway, so that's something.
Thank you very much, comrade. I do try.
Oh my god. Okay. Thank you very much. Look, we've been going for we're approaching the 3-hour mark at this stage. We'll take one more question and then we'll sort of wrap things up with some shout outs and all that sort of stuff. Last question, fun one here. Richard Deckard asks, giant mushroom buildings and hemp cars when?
2040 or we're all dead.
High hopes. I'm hoping the all dead option is not the inevitable one, but well, let's see.
Communism within our lifetimes is certainly a position I would argue is possible.
You think so? You think higher stage communism?
Or I think
just lower stage?
It's very, very ambitious, but I do think potentially, because you know, humanity is capable of amazing things when it mass mobilizes, and you know, if it mass mobilized to create an environmentally sustainable cyber communism, then I think people would get psyched about that as well. I'm not gonna lie.
Be pretty based. Be pretty fucking based. Space communism.
I do think it's possible. Certainly, at least the lower stage.
Well, I'm hoping so. I've got high hopes for the comrades in the Philippines. Maybe the comrades in India as well. Maybe sparking off something. You know, just toppling over like a fucking the dominoes sort of falling. Then, you know, I mean, because we're still, well, the thing is, we're still kind of grappling with like the end of history. You know, socialism didn't work. That kind of idea that there is no alternative. And so I think, but like once we have like one actual socialist revolution, I think that's probably going to spark off a lot more. You know, and I'm very hopeful.
I think we might differ a little bit on whether the extent to which we would say that. I mean, because I still maintain Cuba as a form of socialism. That's a longer debate. And I officially don't have a position on China published because I don't want to have, like, I just don't want to get involved in that debate. Frankly, I would apply frankly. I know a bit about China, but my position is no investigation, no right to speak. You know, I'll admit my own shortcomings there. I haven't done enough reading to give a position. Then the other kind of thing I would add on that is, I think like we're quite close in places like Haiti and things like that in terms of mass organic movement as well. Haiti's one that I would really highlight, particularly given the importance of the Haitian Revolution against slavery for ending feudalism and slavery in the United States is quite a significant one.
It definitely. Lots of mobilized around there, yeah, definitely. It's about getting organized. The energy is there. People are furious. So I suppose now it's can people get organized? Can we get everybody organized and together and ready to actually see this through? Actually see us through to communism, you know. So, okay, brilliant, comrade. Thank you so much. This has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you for taking the time out to come on and discuss communism and the environmental crisis this evening. It's been enlightening. I've learned so much. Before we wrap up, would you like to tell the audience about your upcoming projects? Alternatively, if there's anything or anyone else you'd like to shout out, now is the time to do that.
So thank you very much for having me on, comrade. It's been a really a pleasure and a joy. Thank you. of next projects, we've got a video, I think, coming out this weekend on something that has been raised in the chat on digital feudalism as a potential class society emerging out of capitalism's ruins and what that might look like, as a negative critique of the idea of data barons. So that'll be dropping soon. The video after that, we're going to be analysing the revolution in Haiti, and that's kind of our plans for the upcoming future. I'd like to give a shout out to Ted Reese's book, because I do this on literally everything I'm on at the moment. Read Socialism or Extinction, Climate, Automation and War in the Final Capitalist Breakdown by Ted Reese. It is a fundamental of modern Marxism. I was lucky enough to have worked on it as an editor, so I'm definitely biased. But go and read it. It's available in hard copy right now. Go and get a copy. So yeah, that's it.
Brilliant. We'll definitely check those out. Comrades, if you weren't here earlier on, please do subscribe to Prolekult's channel. It's absolutely fantastic. You'll see a bunch of amazing documentaries on there. Help a comrade out. Follow them on Twitter. If you can, throw a euro, dollar, a pound, whatever it might be, over on Patreon, and support this left-wing content creation. Comrades, we're going to wrap it up there. Thanks to everybody in the chat. I hope you have enjoyed this. I hope you have found this useful. I hope you enjoyed the weekend. I know I haven't been doing as many videos. It seems like I haven't been doing as many videos or releasing as many videos recently. I've actually been doing a couple. I've had I'm going to be doing a collaboration with Second Thought. I'm going to be releasing a video in collaboration with Second Thought, and I've had to spend a bit of time preparing that. But that's actually not going to be released until the start of April, so it's going to be probably 2 or 3 weeks from now. But yeah, I have been working away. I'm hoping to have a new video out on Saturday, new Socialism 101 video out on Saturday. So hopefully that'll be Saturday. If not Saturday, then definitely Sunday. So yeah, comrades, have a great weekend. Enjoy yourselves. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Prolekult. It's been absolutely fantastic. I've really enjoyed this. I've learned a lot, and it's been hilarious learning about mushrooms and hemp and all this stuff. I'll never look at mushrooms the same way again. But a necessary educational session.
I hope I haven't ruined anyone's dinner. That's all I'm saying.
I'm not gonna look at my dinner the same way again. Brilliant. Comrades, thank you very much. Cheers, everybody. August Slán go fóill. Take care.